Letter 48 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 48. Miss Howe to John Belford, Esquire, Saturday, September 30th. Sir, I little thought I ever could have owed so much obligation to any man as you have laid me under. And yet what you have sent me has almost broken my heart and ruined my eyes. I am surprised, though agreeably, that you have so soon and so well got over that part of the trust you have engaged in, which relates to the family. It may be presumed from the exits you mention of 2 of the infernal man's accomplices, that the thunderbolt will not stop short of the principal. Indeed, I have some pleasure to think it seems rolling along towards the devoted head that has plotted all the mischief. But let me, however, say, that although I think Mr. Morden not altogether in the wrong in his reasons for resentment, as he is the dear creature's kinsman and trustee, yet I think you very much in the right in endeavouring to dissuade him from it, as you are her executor, and act in pursuance of her earnest request. But what a letter is that of the infernal man's! I cannot observe upon it, neither can I, for very different reasons, upon my dear creature's posthumous letters, particularly on that to him. O Mr. Belford, what numberless perfections died when my Clarissa drew her last breath! If decency be observed in his letters, for I have not yet had patience to read above 2 or 3 of them, besides this horrid one, which I return to you enclosed, I may some time hence be curious to look, by their means, into the hearts of wretches which, though they must be the abhorrence of virtuous minds, will, when they are laid open, as I presume they are in them, afford a proper warning to those who read them, and teach them to detest men of such profligate characters. If your reformation be sincere, you will not be offended that I do not accept you on this occasion, and thus have I helped you to a criterion to try yourself by. By this letter of the wicked man it is apparent that there are still wickeder women. But see what a guilty commerce with the devils of your sex will bring those to, whose morals ye have ruined. For these women were once innocent. It was man that made them otherwise. The first bad man, perhaps, threw them upon worse men, those upon still worse, till they commenced devils incarnate. The height of wickedness or of shame is not arrived at all at once, as I have somewhere heard observed. But this man, this monster rather, for him to curse these women, and to curse the dear creature's family, implacable as the latter were, in order to lighten a burden he voluntarily took up and groans under, is meanness added to wickedness, and in vain will he one day find his low plea of sharing with her friends and with those common wretches a guilt which will be adjudged him as all his own, though they too may meet their punishment, as it is evidently begun, in the first in their ineffectual reproaches of one another, in the second, as you have told me. This letter of the abandoned wretch I have not shown to any body, not even to Mr. Hickman, for, sir, I must tell you, I do not as yet think it the same thing as only seeing it myself. Mr. Hickman, like the rest of his sex, would grow upon indulgence. One distinction from me would make him pay 2 to himself. Insolent creepers, or encroachers, all of you, to show any of you a favour to-day, you would expect it as a right to-morrow. I am, as you see, very open and sincere with you, and design in another letter to be still more so, in answer to your call, and Colonel Morden's call upon me, in a point that concerns me to explain myself upon to my beloved creature's executor, and to the Colonel, as her only tender and only worthy relation. I cannot but highly applaud Colonel Morden for his generosity to Miss Dolly Hervey. Oh, that he had arrived time enough to save my inimitable friend from the machinations of the vilest of men, and from the envy and malice of the most selfish and implacable of brothers and sisters. Anna Howe. End of letter 48. Letter 49 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 49. Miss Howe to John Belford, Esquire, Monday, October 2nd. When you question me, sir, as you do, and on a subject so affecting to me, in the character of the representative of my best beloved friend, and have in every particular hitherto acted up to that character, you are entitled to my regard, especially as you are joined in your questioning of me by a gentleman whom I look upon as the dearest and nearest, because worthiest, relation of my dear friend, and who it seems has been so severe a censurer of my conduct, that your politeness will not permit you to send me his letter, with others of his, but a copy only, in which the passages reflecting upon me are omitted. I presume, however, that what is meant by this alarming freedom of the Colonel is no more than what you both have already hinted to me, as if you thought I were not inclined to pay so much regard to my beloved creature's last will in my own case, as I would have others pay to it, a charge that I ought not to be quite silent under. You have observed, no doubt, that I have seemed to value myself upon the freedom I take in declaring my sentiments without reserve upon every subject that I pretend to touch upon. And I can hardly question that I have, or shall, in your opinion, by my unceremonious treatment of you upon so short an acquaintance, run into the error of those who, wanting to be thought above hypocrisy and flattery, fall into rusticity, if not ill manners, a common fault with such who, not caring to correct constitutional failings, seek to gloss them over by some nominal virtue, when all the time, perhaps, these failings are entirely owing to native arrogance, or at least to a contracted rust, that they will not, because it would give them pain, submit to have filed off. You see, sir, that I can, however, be as free with myself as with you, and by what I am going to write you will find me still more free, and yet I am aware that such of my sex as will not assume some little dignity, and exact respect from yours, will render themselves cheap, and perhaps, for their modesty and diffidence, be repaid with scorn and insult. But the scorn I will endeavour not to deserve, and the insult I will not bear. In some of the dear creature's papers, which you have had in your possession, and must again have, in order to get transcribed, you will find several friendly but severe reprehensions of me, on account of a natural, or at least an habitual, warmth of temper, which she was pleased to impute to me. I was thinking to give you her charge against me in her own words, from one of her letters delivered to me with her own hands, on taking leave of me on the last visit she honoured me with. But I will supply that charge by confession of more than it imports, to wit, that I am haughty, uncontrollable, and violent in my temper. This I say. Impatient of contradiction, was my beloved's charge, from any body but her dear self, she should have said, and aim not at that affability, that gentleness, next to meekness, which, in the letter I was going to communicate, she tells me are the peculiar and indispensable characteristics of a real fine lady, who, she is pleased to say, should appear to be goalless as a dove, and never should know what warmth or high spirit is, but in the cause of religion or virtue, or in cases where her own honour, the honour of a friend, or that of an innocent person, is concerned. Now, sir, as I needs must plead guilty to this indictment, do you think I ought not to resolve upon a single life? I, who have such an opinion of your sex, that I think there is not one man in 100 whom a woman of sense and spirit can either honour or obey, though you make us promise both in that solemn form of words, which unites, or rather binds us to you in marriage. When I look round upon all the married people of my acquaintance, and see how they live, and what they bear who live best, I am confirmed in my dislike to the state. Well do your sex contrive to bring us up fools and idiots, in order to make us bear the yoke you lay upon our shoulders, and that we may not despise you from our hearts, as we certainly should, if we were brought up as you are, for your ignorance, as much as you often make us do, as it is, for your insolence. These, sir, are some of my notions, and with these notions let me repeat my question. Do you think I ought to marry at all? If I marry either a sordid or an imperious wretch, can I, do you think, live with him? And ought a man of a contrary character, for the sake of either of our reputations, to be plagued with me? Long did I stand out against all the offers made me, and against all the persuasions of my mother. And to tell you the truth, the longer and with the more obstinacy, as the person my choice would have first fallen upon was neither approved by my mother nor by my dear friend. This riveted me to my pride and to my opposition. For although I was convinced after a while that my choice would neither have been prudent nor happy, and that the specious wretch was not what he had made me believe he was, yet could I not easily think of any other man, and indeed, from the detection of him, took a settled aversion to the whole sex. At last Mr. Hickman offered himself, a man worthy of a better choice. He had the good fortune, he thinks it so, to be agreeable, and to make his proposals agreeable, to my mother. As to myself, I own, that were I to have chosen a brother, Mr. Hickman should have been the man. Virtuous, sober, sincere, friendly, as he is. But I wish not to marry, nor knew either man in the world whom I could think deserving of my beloved friend. But neither of our parents would let us live single. The accursed Lovelace was proposed warmly to her at one time, and while she was yet but indifferent to him, they, by ungenerous usage of him, for then, sir, he was not known to be Beelzebub himself, and by endeavouring to force her inclinations in favour first of one worthless man, then of another, in antipathy to him, through her foolish brother's caprice, turned that indifference, from the natural generosity of her soul, into a regard which she never otherwise would have had for a man of his character. Mr. Hickman was proposed to me. I refused him again and again. He persisted. My mother his advocate. I told him my dislike of all men, of him, of matrimony. Still he persisted. I used him with tyranny, led indeed partly by my temper, partly by design, hoping thereby to get rid of him, till the poor man, his character unexceptionably uniform, still persisting, made himself a merit with me by his patience. This brought down my pride. I never, Sir, was accounted very ungenerous, nor quite ungrateful, and gave me at one time an inferiority in my own opinion to him, which lasted just long enough for my friends to prevail upon me to promise him encouragement, and to receive his addresses. Having done so, when the weather glass of my pride got up again, I found I had gone too far to recede. My mother and my friends both held me to it. Yet I tried him, I vexed him, 100 ways, and not so much neither with design to vex him, as to make him hate me, and decline his suit. He bore this, however, and got nothing but my pity. Yet still my mother and my friend, having obtained my promise, made, however, not to him, but to them, and being well assured that I valued no man more than Mr. Hickman, who never once disobliged me in word or deed or look, except by his foolish perseverance, insisted upon the performance. While my dear friend was in her unhappy uncertainty, I could not think of marriage. And now, what encouragement have I? She, my monitress, my guide, my counsel, gone, for ever gone, by whose advice and instructions I hope to acquit myself tolerably in the state to which I could not avoid entering. For, Sir, my mother is so partially Mr. Hickman's friend, that I am sure, should any difference arise, she would always censure me, and acquit him, even were he ungenerous enough to remember me in his day. This, Sir, being my situation, consider how difficult it is for me to think of marriage. Whenever we approve, we can find 100 good reasons to justify our approbation. Whenever we dislike, we can find 1,000 to justify our dislike. Every thing in the latter case is an impediment, every shadow a bugbear. Thus can I enumerate and swell, perhaps, only imaginary grievances. I must go whither he would have me to go, visit whom he would have me to visit. Well as I love to write, though now, alas, my grand inducement to write is over, it must be to whom he pleases. And Mrs. Hickman, who, as Miss Howe, cannot do wrong, would hardly ever be able to do right. Thus the tables turned upon me, I am reminded of my vowed obedience, madammed up perhaps to matrimonial perfection, and all the wedded warfare practised, comfortably over between us, for I shall not be passive under insolent treatment, till we become curses to each other, a byword to our neighbours, and the jest of our own servants. But there must be bear and forbear, methinks some wise body will tell me. But why must I be teased into a state where that must be necessarily the case, when now I can do as I please, and wish only to be let alone to do as best pleases me? And what, in effect, does my mother say? Anna Howe, you now do every thing that pleases you. You now have nobody to control you. You go and you come. You dress and you undress. You rise and you go to rest, just as you think best. But you must be happier still, child. As how, madam? Why, you must marry, my dear, and have none of these options, but in every thing do as your husband commands you. This is very hard, you will own, Sir, for such a one as me to think of. And yet, engaged to enter into that state as I am, how can I help myself? My mother presses me, my friend, my beloved friend, writing as from the dead, presses me, and you and Mr. Morden, as executors of her will, remind me. The man is not afraid of me. I am sure, were I the man, I should not have half his courage, and I think I ought to conclude to punish him, the only effectual way I have to do it, for his perverse adherence and persecution, with the grant of his own wishes, a punishment which many others who enjoy theirs very commonly experience. Let me then assure you, Sir, that when I can find, in the words of my charming friend in her will, writing of her cousin Hervey, that my grief for her is mellowed by time into a remembrance more sweet than painful, that I may not be utterly unworthy of the passion a man of some merit has for me, I will answer the request of my dear friend, so often repeated and so earnestly pressed, and Mr. Hickman shall find, if he continue to deserve my gratitude, that my endeavours shall not be wanting to make him amends for the patience he has had, and must still a little while longer have with me. And then will it be his own fault, I hope not mine, if our marriage answer not those happy prognostics, which filled her generous presaging mind upon this view, as she once, for my encouragement, and to induce me to encourage him, told me. Thus, Sir, have I, in a very free manner, accounted to you, as to the executor of my beloved friend, for all that relates to you, as such, to know, and even for more than I needed to do against myself, only that you will find as much against me in some of her letters, and so, losing nothing, I gain the character of ingenuousness with you. And thus much for the double reprimand on my delaying my part of the performance of my dear friend's will. And now, while you are admonishing me on this subject, let me remind you of one great article relating to yourself. It is furnished me by my dear creature's posthumous letter to you. I hope you will not forget that the most benevolent of her sex expresses herself as earnestly concerned for your thorough reformation, as she does for my marrying. You'll see to it, then, that her wishes are as completely answered in that particular as you are desirous they should be in all others. I have, I own, disobeyed her in one article, and that is, where she desires I would not put myself into mourning. I could not help it. I send this, and mine of Saturday last, together, and will not add another word, after I have told you that I think myself your obliged servant, A. Howe. End of Letter 49. Letter 50 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 50. Mr. Belford to Miss Howe, Thursday night, October 5th. I return you, Madam, my most respectful thanks for your condescending hint in relation to the pious wishes of your exalted friend for my thorough reformation. I will only say, that it will be my earnest and unwearied endeavour to make those generous wishes effectual, and I hope for the divine blessing upon such my endeavours, or else I know they will be in vain. I cannot, Madam, express how much I think myself obliged to you for your further condescension in writing to me so frankly the state of your past and present mind in relation to the single and matrimonial life. If the lady by whom, as the executor of her inimitable friend, I am thus honoured, has failings, never were failings so lovely in woman. How much more lovely, indeed, than the virtues of many of her sex! I might have ventured into the hands of such a lady the Colonel's original letter entire. The worthy gentleman exceedingly admires you, and this caution was the effect of his politeness only, and of his regard for you. I send you, Madam, a letter from Lord M. to myself, and the copies of 3 others written in consequence of that. These will acquaint you with Mr. Lovelace's departure from England, and with other particulars which you will be curious to know. Be pleased to keep to yourself such of the contents as your own prudence will suggest to you ought not to be seen by any body else. I am, Madam, with the profoundest and most grateful respect, your faithful and obliged humble servant, John Belford. End of Letter 50. Letter 51 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 51. Lord M. to John Belford, Esq., M. Hall, Friday, September 29th. Dear Sir, my kinsman Lovelace is now setting out for London, proposing to see you, and then to go to Dover, and so embark. God send him well out of the kingdom. On Monday he will be with you, I believe. Pray let me be favoured with an account of all your conversations, for Mr. Mowbray and Mr. Tourville are to be there too, and whether you think he is grown quite his own man again. What I mostly write for is, to wish you to keep Colonel Morden and him asunder, and so I give you notice of his going to town. I should be very loath there should be any mischief between them, as you gave me notice that the Colonel threatened my nephew. But my kinsman would not bear that, so nobody let him know that he did. But I hope there is no fear, for the Colonel does not, as I hear, threaten now. For his own sake I am glad of that, for there is not such a man in the world as my kinsman is said to be, at all the weapons, as well he was not. He would not be so daring. We shall all here miss the wild fellow. To be sure there is no man better company when he pleases. Pray, do you never travel 30 or 40 miles? I should be glad to see you here at M. Hall. It will be charity when my kinsman is gone, for we suppose you will be his chief correspondent, although he has promised to write to my nieces often. But he is very apt to forget his promises, to us his relations particularly. God preserve us all. Amen. Praise your very humble servant, M. End of Letter 51. Letter 52 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 52. Mr. Belford to Lord M. London, Tuesday night, October 3rd. My Lord, I obey your Lordship's commands with great pleasure. Yesterday in the afternoon Mr. Lovelace made me a visit at my lodgings. As I was in expectation of one from Colonel Morden about the same time, I thought proper to carry him to a tavern which neither of us frequented, on pretence of a half appointment, ordering notice to be sent me thither if the Colonel came. And Mr. Lovelace sent to Mowbray and Tourville and Mr. Dolman of Uxbridge, who came to town to take leave of him, to let them know where to find us. Mr. Lovelace is too well recovered, I was going to say. I never saw him more gay, lively, and handsome. We had a good deal of bluster about some parts of the trust I had engaged in, and upon freedoms I had treated him with, in which he would have it that I had exceeded our agreed upon limits, But on the arrival of our 3 old companions, and a nephew of Mr. Dolman's, who had a good while been desirous to pass an hour with Mr. Lovelace, it blew off for the present. Mr. Mowbray and Mr. Tourville had also taken some exceptions at the freedoms of my pen; and Mr. Lovelace, after his way, took upon him to reconcile us, and did it at the expense of all 3, and with such an infinite run of humour and raillery, that we had nothing to do but to laugh at what he said, and at one another. I can deal tolerably with him at my pen, but in conversation he has no equal. In short, it was his day. He was glad, he said, to find himself alive; and his 2 friends, clapping and rubbing their hands 20 times in an hour, declared, that now once more he was all himself, the charmingest fellow in the world, and they would follow him to the furthest part of the globe. I threw a burr upon his coat now and then, but none would stick. Your Lordship knows that there are many things which occasion a roar of applause in conversation, when the heart is open, and men are resolved to be merry, which will neither bear repeating nor thinking of afterwards. Common things in the mouth of a man we admire, and whose wit has passed upon us for sterling, become, in a gay hour, uncommon. We watch every turn of such a one's countenance, and are resolved to laugh when he smiles, even before he utters what we are expecting to flow from his lips. Mr. Dolman and his nephew took leave of us by 12. Mowbray and Tourville grew very noisy by 1, and were carried off by 2. Wine never moves Mr. Lovelace, notwithstanding a vivacity which generally helps on over gay spirits. As to myself, the little part I had taken in the gaiety kept me unconcerned. The clock struck 3 before I could get him into any serious or attentive way, so natural to him is gaiety of heart, and such strong hold had the liveliness of the evening taken of him. His conversation, you know, my Lord, when his heart is free, runs off to the bottom without any dregs. But after that hour, and when we thought of parting, he became a little more serious, and then he told me his designs, and gave me a plan of his intended tour, wishing heartily that I could have accompanied him. We parted about 4, he not a little dissatisfied with me, for we had some talk about subjects which he said he loved not to think of, to wit, Miss Harlowe's will, my executorship, papers I had in confidence communicated to that admirable lady, with no unfriendly design, I assure your Lordship, and he insisting upon, and I refusing, the return of the letters he had written to me, from the time that he had made his first addresses to her. He would see me once again, he said, and it would be upon very ill terms if I complied not with his request, which I bid him not expect. But that I might not deny him every thing, I told him that I would give him a copy of the will, though I was sure, I said, when he read it, he would wish he had never seen it. I had a message from him about 11 this morning, desiring me to name a place at which to dine with him and Mowbray and Tourville for the last time; and soon after another from Colonel Morden, inviting me to pass the evening with him at the Bedford Head in Covent Garden; and that I might keep them at a distance from one another, I appointed Mr. Lovelace at the Eagle in Suffolk street. There I met him and 2 others. We began where we left off at our last parting, and were very high with each other. But at last all was made up, and he offered to forget and forgive every thing, on condition that I would correspond with him while abroad, and continue the series which had been broken through by his illness, and particularly give him, as I had offered, a copy of the lady's last will. I promised him, and he then fell to rallying me on my gravity, and on my reformation schemes, as he called them. As we walked about the room, expecting dinner to be brought in, he laid his hand upon my shoulder, then pushed me from him with a curse, walking round me and surveying me from head to foot. Then calling for the observations of the others, he turned round upon his heel, and with one of his peculiar wild airs, ha, 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 burst he out, that these sour-faced proselytes should take into their heads that they cannot be pious without forfeiting both their good nature and good manners. Why, Jack, turning me about, prithee look up, man. Dost thou not know that religion, if it has taken proper hold of the heart, is the most cheerful countenance maker in the world? I have heard my beloved Miss Harlowe say so, and she knew, or nobody did. And was not her aspect a benign proof of the observation? But thou these wamblings in thy cursed gizzard, and thy awkward grimaces, I see thou art but a novice in it yet. Ah, Belford, Belford, thou hast a confounded parcel of briars and thorns to trample over barefoot, before religion will illuminate these gloomy features. I give your Lordship this account in answer to your desire to know if I think him the man he was. In our conversation at dinner he was balancing whether he should set out the next morning, or the morning after. But finding he had nothing to do, and Colonel Morden being in town, which, however, I told him not of, I turned the scale, and he agreed upon setting out to-morrow morning, they to see him embark, and I promised to accompany them for a morning's ride, as they proposed their horses, but said that I must return in the afternoon. With much reluctance they let me go to my evening's appointment. They little thought with whom, for Mr. Lovelace had put it as a case of honour to all of us, whether, as he had been told that Mr. Morden and Mr. James Harlowe had thrown out menaces against him, he ought to leave the kingdom till he had thrown himself in their way. Mowbray gave his opinion that he ought to leave it like a man of honour, as he was; and if he did not take those gentlemen to task for their opprobrious speeches, that at least he should be seen by them in public before he went away, else they might give themselves airs, as if he had left the kingdom in fear of them. To this he himself so much inclined, that it was with difficulty I persuaded him that, as they had neither of them proceeded to a direct and formal challenge, as they knew he had not made himself difficult of access, and as he had already done the family injury enough, and it was Miss Harlowe's earnest desire that he would be content with that, he had no reason, from any point of honour, to delay his journey, especially as he had so just a motive for his going, as the establishing of his health, and as he might return the sooner, if he saw occasion for it. I found the Colonel in a very solemn way. We had a good deal of discourse upon the subject of certain letters which had passed between us in relation to Miss Harlowe's will, and to her family. He has some accusations to settle with his banker, which, he says, will be adjusted to morrow; and on Thursday he proposes to go down again to take leave of his friends, and then intends to set out directly for Italy. I wish Mr. Lovelace could have been prevailed upon to take any other tour than that of France and Italy. I did propose Madrid to him, but he laughed at me, and told me that the proposal was in character from a meal, and from one who was become as grave as a Spaniard of the old cut at 90. I expressed to the Colonel my apprehensions that his cousin's dying injunctions would not have the force upon him that were to be wished. They have great force upon me, Mr. Belford, said he, or one world would not have held Mr. Lovelace and me thus long. But my intention is to go to Florence, and not to lay my bones there, as upon my cousin's death I told you I ought to do, but to settle all my affairs in those parts, and then to come over, and reside upon a little paternal estate in Kent, which is strangely gone to ruin in my absence. Indeed, were I to meet Mr. Lovelace either here or abroad, I might not be answerable for the consequences. He would have engaged me for to-morrow, but having promised to attend Mr. Lovelace on his journey, as I have mentioned, I said, I was obliged to go out of town, and was uncertain as to the time of my return in the evening, and so I am to see him on Thursday morning at my own lodgings. I will do myself the honour to write again to your Lordship to-morrow night. Mean time, I am, my Lord, your Lordship's, etc. End of letter 52. Letter 53 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 53. Mr. Belford to Lord M. Wednesday night, October 4th. My Lord, I am just returned from attending Mr. Lovelace as far as Gad's Hill, near Rochester. He was exceeding gay all the way. Mowbray and Tourville are gone on with him. They will see him embark and under sail, and promise to follow him in a month or two, for they say there is no living without him, now he is once more himself. He and I parted with great and even solemn tokens of affection, but yet not without gay intermixtures, as I will acquaint your Lordship. Taking me aside, and clasping his arms about me, Adieu, dear Belford, said he. May you proceed in the course you have entered upon. Whatever airs I give myself, this charming creature has fast hold of me here, clapping his hand upon his heart, and I must either appear what you see me, or be what I so lately was. Oh, the divine creature! Lifting up his eyes. But if I live to come to England, and you remain fixed in your present way, and can give me encouragement, I hope rather to follow your example than to ridicule you for it. This will, for I had given him a copy of it, I will make the companion of my solitary hours. You have told me a part of its melancholy contents, and that, and her posthumous letter, shall be my study, and they will prepare me for being your disciple, if you hold on. You, Jack, may marry, continued he, and I have a wife in my eye for you. Only thou art such an awkward mortal. He saw me affected, and thought to make me smile. But we don't make ourselves, except it be worse, by our dress. Thou art in mourning now, as well as I. But if ever thy ridiculous turn lead thee again to be beau brocade, I will bedizen thee, as the girls say, on my return, to my own fancy, and according to thy own natural appearance. Thou shalt doctor my soul, and I will doctor thy body. Thou shalt see what a clever fellow I will make of thee. As for me, I never will, I never can marry. That I will not take a few liberties, and that I will not try to start some of my former game, I won't promise. Habits are not so easily shaken off, but they shall be by way of wearing. So return and reform shall go together. And now, thou sorrowful monkey, what aileth thee? I do love him, my lord. Adieu, and once more adieu, embracing me.
And when thou thinkest thou hast made thyself an interest out yonder, looking up, then put in a word for thy Lovelace. Joining company, he recommended to me to write often, and promised to let me hear quickly from him, and that he would write to your Lordship, and to all his family round, for he said, that you had all been more kind to him than he had deserved. And so we parted. I hope, my Lord, for all your noble family's sake, that we shall see him soon return, and reform, as he promises. I return your Lordship my humble thanks for the honour of your invitation to M. Hall. The first letter I receive from Mr. Lovelace shall give me the opportunity of embracing it. I am, my Lord, your most faithful and obedient servant, J. Belford. End of letter 53. Letter 54 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 54. Mr. Belford to Lord M. Thursday morning, October 5th. It may be some satisfaction to your Lordship to have a brief account of what has just now passed between Colonel Morden and me. We had a good deal of discourse about the Harlowe family, and those parts of the lady's will which still remain unexecuted. After which the Colonel addressed himself to me in a manner which gave me some surprise. He flattered himself, he said, from my present happy turn, and from my good constitution, that I should live a great many years. It was therefore his request that I would consent to be his executor, since it was impossible for him to make a better choice, or pursue a better example, than his cousin had set. His heart, he said, was in it. There were some things in his cousin's will and his analogous, and he had named one person to me, with whom he was sure I would not refuse to be joined, and to whom he intended to apply for his consent, when he had obtained mine, intimating, as far as I could gather, that it was Mr. Hickman, son of Sir Charles Hickman, to whom I know your Lordship is not a stranger, for he said every one who was dear to his beloved cousin must be so to him, and he knew that the gentleman who he had thoughts of would have, besides my advice and assistance, the advice of one of the most sensible ladies in England. What is between crotchets thus, Mr. Belford omitted in the transcription of this letter to Miss Howe. He took my hand, seeing me under some surprise. You must not hesitate, much less deny me, Mr. Belford. Indeed, you must not. 2 things I will assure you of, that I have, as I hope, made every thing so clear that you cannot have any litigation, and that I have done so justly, and I hope it will be thought so generously, by all my relations, that a mind like yours will rather have pleasure than pain in the execution of this trust. And this is what I think every honest man, who hopes to find an honest man for his executor, should do. I told him that I was greatly obliged to him for his good opinion of me, that it was so much every man's duty to be an honest man, that it could not be interpreted as vanity to say that I had no doubt to be found so. But if I accepted of this trust, it must be on condition. I could name no condition, he said, interrupting me, which he would refuse to comply with. This condition, I told him, was, that as there was as great a probability of his being my survivor as I his, he would permit me to name him for mine, and in that case a week should not pass before I made my will. With all his heart, he said, and the readier, as he had no apprehensions of suddenly dying, for what he had done and requested was really the effect of the satisfaction he had taken in the part I had already acted as his cousin's executor, and in my ability, he was pleased to add, as well as in pursuance of his cousin's advice in the preamble of her will, to wit, that this was a work which should be set about in full health, both of body and mind. I told him that I was pleased to hear him say that he was not in any apprehension of suddenly dying, as this gave me assurance that he had laid aside all thoughts of acting contrary to the dying request of his beloved cousin. Does it argue, said he, smiling, that if I were to pursue a vengeance so justifiable in my own opinion, I must be in apprehension of falling by Mr. Lovelace's hand? I will assure you that I have no fears of that sort, but I know this is an ungrateful subject to you. Mr. Lovelace is your friend, and I will allow, that a good man may have a friendship for a bad one, so far as to wish him well, without countenancing him in his evil. I will assure you, added he, that I have not yet made any resolutions either way. I have told you what force my cousin's repeated requests have with me. Hitherto they have withheld me. But let us quit this subject. This, sir, giving me a sealed-up parcel, is my will. It is witnessed. I made no doubt of prevailing upon you to do me the requested favour. I have a duplicate to leave with the other gentleman, and an attested copy, which I shall deposit at my banker's. At my return, which will be in 6 or 8 months at furthest, I will allow you to make an exchange of yours, if you will have it so. I have only now to take leave of my relations in the country. And so, God protect you, Mr. Belford. You will soon hear of me again. He then very solemnly embraced me, as I did him, and we parted. I heartily congratulate your Lordship on the narrow escape each gentleman has had from the other, for I apprehend that they could not have met without fatal consequences. Time, I hope, which subdues all things, will subdue their resentments. I am, my Lord, your Lordship's most faithful and obedient servant, J. Belford. Several other letters passed between Miss Howe and Mr. Belford, relating to the disposition of the papers and letters, to the Poor's Fund, and to other articles of the lady's will, wherein the method of proceeding in each case was adjusted. After which the papers were returned to Mr. Belford, that he might order the 2 directed copies of them to be taken. In one of these letters Mr. Belford requests Miss Howe to give the character of the friend she so dearly loved, a task he imagines that will be as agreeable to herself as worthy of her pen. I am more especially curious to know, says he, what was that particular disposition of her time, which I find mentioned in a letter which I have just dipped into, where her sister is enviously reproaching her on that score.
This information may enable me, says he,
to account for what has often surprised me, how, at so tender an age, this admirable lady became mistress of such extraordinary and such various qualifications.
End of letter 54.
Letter 55 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 55. Miss Howe to John Belford, Esquire, Thursday, October 12th. Sir, I am incapable of doing justice to the character of my beloved friend, and that not only from want of talents, but from grief, which I think rather increases than diminishes by time, and which will not let me sit down to a task that requires so much thought, and a greater degree of accuracy, than I ever believed myself mistress of. And yet I so well approve of your motion, that I will throw into your hands a few materials, that may serve by way of supplement, as I may say, to those you will be able to collect from the papers themselves. From Colonel Morden's letters to you, particularly that of September 23rd, and from the letters of the detestable wretch himself, who I find has done her justice, although to his own condemnation. All these together will enable you, who seem to be so great an admirer of her virtues, to perform the task, and, I think, better than any person I know. But I make it my request, that if you do any thing in this way, you will let me see it. If I find it not to my mind, I will add or diminish, as justice shall require. She was a wonderful creature from her infancy, but I suppose you intend to give a character of her at those years when she was qualified to be an example to other young ladies, rather than a history of her life. Perhaps, nevertheless, you will choose to give a description of her person, and as you knew not the dear creature when her heart was easy, I will tell you what yet, in part, you can confirm. That her shape was so fine, her proportions so exact, her features so regular, her complexion so lovely, and her whole person and manner so distinguishedly charming, that she could not move without being admired and followed by the eyes of every one, those strangers who never saw her before. Colonel Morden's letter above referred to will confirm this. In her dress she was elegant beyond imitation, and generally led the fashion to all the ladies round her, without seeming to intend it, and without being proud of doing so. She was rather tall, than of a middling stature, and had a dignity in her aspect and air that bespoke the mind that animated every feature. This native dignity, as I may call it, induced some superficial persons, who knew not how to account for the reverence which involuntarily filled their hearts on her appearance, to impute pride to her. But these were such as knew that they should have been proud of any one of her perfections. Judging therefore by their own narrowness, they thought it impossible that the lady who possessed so many should not think herself superior to them all. Indeed, I have heard her noble aspect found fault with, as indicating pride and superiority. But people awed and controlled, though but by their own consciousness of inferiority, will find fault, right or wrong, with those, whose rectitude of mind and manners their own culpable hearts give them to be afraid. But, in the bad sense of the word, Miss Clarissa Harlowe knew not what pride was. You may, if you touch upon this subject, throw in these sentences of hers, spoken at different times, and on different occasions. Persons of accidental or shadowy merit may be proud, but inborn worth must be always as much above conceit as arrogance. Who can be better or more worthy than they should be? And who shall be proud of talents they give not to themselves? The darkest and most contemptible ignorance is that of not knowing one's self, and that all we have, and all we excel in, is the gift of God. All human excellence is but comparative. There are persons who excel us, as much as we fancy we excel the meanest. In the general scale of beings, the lowest is as useful, and as much a link of the great chain, as the highest. The grace that makes every other grace amiable is humility. There is but one pride pardonable, that of being above doing a base or dishonourable action. Such were the sentiments by which this admirable young lady endeavoured to conduct herself, and to regulate her conduct to others. And, in truth, never were affability and complacency, graciousness some have called it, more eminent in any person, man or woman, than in her to those who put it in her power to oblige them, insomuch that the benefited has sometimes not known which to prefer, the grace bestowed, or the manner in which it was conferred. It has been observed that what was said of Henry the Fourth of France might be said of her manner of refusing a request, that she generally sent from her presence the person refused nearly as well satisfied as if she had granted it. Then she had such a sacred regard to truth. You cannot, Sir, expatiate too much upon this topic. I dare say, that in all her letters, in all the letters of the wretch, her veracity will not once be found impeachable, although her calamities were so heavy, the horrid man's wiles so subtle, and her struggles to free herself from them so active. Her charity was so great, that she always chose to defend or acquit where the fault was not so flagrant that it became a piece of justice to condemn it, and was always an advocate for an absent person, whose discretion was called in question without having given manifest proofs of indiscretion. Once I remember, in a large circle of ladies, every one of which, I among the rest, having censured a generally reported indiscretion in a young lady, "Come, my Miss Howe," said she, for we had agreed to take each other to task when either thought the other gave occasion for it, and when, by blaming each other, we intended a general reprehension which, as she used to say, it would appear arrogant or assuming to level more properly, "let me be Miss Fanny Darlington." Then removing out of the circle, and standing up, "Here I stand, unworthy of a seat with the rest of the company, till I have cleared myself. And now, suppose me to be her, let me hear you charge, and do you hear what the poor culprit can say to it in her own defence?" And then answering the conjectural and unproved circumstances by circumstances as fairly to be supposed favourable, she brought off triumphantly the censured lady, and so much to every one's satisfaction, that she was led to her chair, and voted a double rank in the circle, as the reinstated Miss Fanny Darlington, and as Miss Clarissa Harlowe. Very few persons, she used to say, would be condemned, or even accused, in the circles of ladies, were they present. It is generous, therefore, nay, it is but just, said she, to take the part of the absent, if not flagrantly culpable. But though wisdom was her birthright, as I may say, yet she had not lived years enow to pretend to so much experience as to exempt her from the necessity of sometimes altering her opinion both of persons and things. But when she found herself obliged to do this, she took care that the particular instance of mistaken worthiness in the person should not narrow or contract her almost universal charity into general doubt or jealousy. An instance of what I mean occurs to my memory. Being upbraided by a severe censure with a person's proving base, whom she had frequently defended, and by whose baseness my beloved friend was a sufferer, "You, madam," said she, "had more penetration than such a young creature as I can pretend to have. But although human depravity may, I doubt, oftener justify those who judge harshly, than human rectitude can those who judge favourably, yet will I not part with my charity. Nevertheless, for the future, I will endeavour, in cases where the judgment of my elders is against me, to make mine consistent with caution and prudence." Indeed, when she was convinced of any error or mistake, however seemingly derogatory to her judgment and sagacity, no one was ever so acknowledging, so ingenuous as she. It was a merit, she used to say, next in degree to that of having avoided error, frankly to own an error, and that the offering at an excuse in a blameable manner was the undoubted mark of a disingenuous, if not of a perverse mind. But I ought to add on this head, of her great charity where character was concerned, and where there was room for charity, that she was always deservedly severe in her reprehensions of a wilful and studied vileness. How could she then forgive the wretch by whose premeditated villany she was entangled? You must every way insist upon it, that had it not been for the stupid persecutions of her relations, she never would have been in the power of that horrid Lovelace. And yet, on several occasions, she acknowledged frankly that were person, and address, and alliance to be allowedly the principal attractives in the choice of a lover, it would not have been difficult for her eye to mislead her heart. When she was last with me, 3 happy weeks together, in every visit the wretch made her, he left her more dissatisfied with him than in the former. And yet his behaviour before her was too specious to have been very exceptionable to a woman who had a less share of that charming delicacy, and of that penetration which so much distinguished her. In obedience to the commands of her gloomy father, on his allowing her to be my guest, for that last time, as it most unhappily proved, she never would see him out of my company, and would often say, when he was gone, "O my Nancy, this is not the man." At other times, "Gay giddy creature, he has always something to be forgiven for." At others, "This man will much sooner excite one's fears than attract one's love." And then would she repeat, "This is not the man." All that the world says of him cannot be untrue. But what title have I to call him to account, who intend not to have him? In short, had she been left to a judgment and discretion, which nobody ever questioned who had either, she would soon have discovered enough of him to cause her to discard him for ever. She was an admirable mistress of all the graces of elocution. The hand she wrote, for the neat and free cut of her letters, like her mind, solid, and above all flourish, for its fairness, evenness, and swiftness, distinguished her as much as the correctness of her orthography, and even punctuation, from the generality of her own sex, and left her none, among the most accurate of the other, who excelled her. And here you may, if you please, take occasion to throw in one hint, for the benefit of such of our sex as are too careless in their orthography, a consciousness of a defect which generally keeps them from writing. She was used to say, it was a proof that a woman understood the derivation as well as sense of the word she used, and that she stopped not at sound, when she spelt accurately. On this head you may take notice, that it was always matter of surprise to her, that the sex are generally so averse as they are to writing, since the pen, next to the needle, of all employments, is the most proper and best adapted to their geniuses, and this as well for improvement as amusement. Who sees not, would she say, that those women who take delight in writing excel the men in all the graces of the familiar style? The gentleness of their minds, the delicacy of their sentiments, improved by the manner of their education, and the liveliness of their imaginations, qualify them to a high degree of preference for this employment; while men of learning, as they are called, that is to say, of mere learning, aiming to get above that natural ease and freedom which distinguish this, and indeed every other kind of writing, when they think they have best succeeded, are got above, or rather beneath, all natural beauty. Then stiffened and starched, let me add, into dry and indelectable affectation, one sort of these scholars assume a style as rough as frequently are their manners. They spangle over their productions with metaphors, they tumble into bombast, the sublime with them lying in words and not in sentiment, they fancy themselves most exalted when least understood, and down they sit, fully satisfied with their own performances, and call them masculine; while a second sort, aiming at wit, that wicked misleader, forfeit all title to judgment; and a third, sinking into the classical pits, there poke and scramble about, never seeking to show genius of their own, all their lives spent in commonplace quotation, fit only to write notes and comments upon other people's texts; all their pride that they know those beauties of 2000 years old in another tongue, which they can only admire, but not imitate in their own. And these, truly, must be learned men, and despisers of our insipid sex. But I need not mention the exceptions which my beloved friend always made, and to which I subscribe, in favour of men of sound learning, true taste, and extensive abilities; nor, in particular, her respect even to reverence for gentlemen of the cloth, which I dare say will appear in every paragraph of her letters, wherever any of the clergy are mentioned. Indeed, the pious Dr. Lewin, the worthy Dr. Bloom, the ingenious Mr. Arnold, and Mr. Tomkins, gentlemen whom she names, in one article of her will, as learned divines with whom she held an early correspondence, well deserved her respect, since to their conversation and correspondence she owed many of her valuable acquirements. Nor were the little slights she would now and then, following, as I must own, my lead, put upon such mere scholars, and her stupid and pedantic brother was one of those who deserved those slights, as despised not only our sex, but all such as had not had their opportunities of being acquainted with the parts of speech, I cannot speak low enough of such, and with the dead languages, owing to that contempt which some affect for what they have not been able to master; for she had an admirable facility for learning languages, and read with great ease both in Italian and French. She had begun to apply herself to Latin, and having such a critical knowledge of her own tongue, and such a foundation from the two others, would soon have made herself an adept in it. But notwithstanding all her acquirements, she was an excellent economist and housewife; and those qualifications, you must take notice, she was particularly fond of inculcating upon all her reading and writing companions of the sex; for it was a maxim with her, that a woman who neglects the useful and the elegant, which distinguish her own sex, for the sake of obtaining the learning which is supposed more peculiar to the other, incurs more contempt by what she foregoes, than she gains credit by what she acquires. All that a woman can learn, she used to say, expatiating on this maxim, above the useful knowledge proper to her sex, let her learn. This will show that she is a good housewife of her time, and that she has not a narrow or confined genius. But then let her not give up for these those more necessary, and therefore not meaner employments, which will qualify her to be a good mistress of a family, a good wife, and a good mother. For what can be more disgraceful to a woman than either, through negligence of dress, to be found a learned slattern, or through ignorance of household management, to be known to be a stranger to domestic economy? She would have it indeed sometimes, from the frequent ill use learned women make of that respectable acquirement, that it was no great matter whether the sex aimed at any thing but excelling in the knowledge of the beauties and graces of their mother tongue. And once she said that this was field enough for a woman, and an ampler was but endangering her family usefulness. But I, who think our sex inferior in nothing to the other but in want of opportunities, of which the narrow-minded mortals industriously seek to deprive us, lest we should surpass them as much in what they chiefly value themselves upon, as we do in all the graces of a fine imagination, could never agree with her in that. And yet I was entirely of her opinion that those women who were solicitous to obtain that knowledge of learning which they suppose would add to their significance in sensible company, and in their attainment of it imagine themselves above all domestic usefulness, deservedly incurred the contempt which they hardly ever failed to meet with. Perhaps you will not think it amiss further to observe on this head, as it will now show that precept and example always went hand in hand with her, that her dairy at her grandfather's was the delight of every one who saw it, and she of all who saw her in it. Her grandfather, in honour of her dexterity and of her skill in all the parts of the dairy management, as well as of the elegance of the offices allotted for that use, would have his seat, before known by the name of the Grove, to be called the Dairy House. She had an easy, convenient, and graceful habit made on purpose, which she put on when she employed herself in these works, and it was noted of her, that in the same hour that she appeared to be a most elegant dairy-maid, she was, when called to a change of dress, the finest lady that ever graced a circle. Her grandfather, father, mother, uncles, aunt, and even her brother and sister, made her frequent visits there, and were delighted with her silent ease and unaffected behaviour in her works, for she always, out of modesty, chose rather the operative than the directive part, that she might not discourage the servant whose proper business it was. Each was fond of a regale from her hands in her dairy house. Her mother and aunt Hervey generally admired her in silence, that they might not give uneasiness to her sister, a spiteful, perverse, unimitating thing, who usually looked upon her all the time with speechless envy. Now and then, however, the pouting creature would suffer extorted and sparing praise to burst open her lips, though looking at the same time like Saul meditating the pointed javelin at the heart of David, the glory of his kingdom. And now, methinks, I see my angel friend, too superior to take notice of her gloom, courting her acceptance of the milk-white curd, from hands more pure than that. Her skill and dexterity in every branch of family management seemed to be the only excellence of her innumerable ones which she owed to her family, whose narrowness, immensely rich and immensely carking, put them upon indulging her in the turn she took to this part of knowledge, while her elder sister affected dress without being graceful in it, and the fine lady, which she could never be, and which her sister was without studying for it, or seeming to know she was so. It was usual with the one sister, when company was expected, to be half the morning dressing, while the other would give directions for the whole business and entertainment of the day, and then go up to her dressing-room, and before she could well be missed, having all her things in admirable order, come down fit to receive company, and with all that graceful ease and tranquillity, as if she had nothing else to think of. Long after her, hours perhaps of previous preparation having passed, down would come rustling and bustling the tawdry and awkward Bella, disordering more her native disorderliness at the sight of her serene sister, by her sullen envy, to see herself so much surpassed with such little pains, and in a sixth part of the time. Yet was this admirable creature mistress of all these domestic qualifications, without the least intermixture of narrowness. She knew how to distinguish between frugality, a necessary virtue, and niggardliness, an odious vice, and used to say, that to define generosity, it must be called the happy medium betwixt parsimony and profusion. She was the most graceful reader I ever knew. She added, by her melodious voice, graces to those she found in the parts of books she read out to her friends, and gave grace and significance to others where they were not. She had no tone, no whine. Her accent was always admirably placed. The emphasis she always forcibly laid as the subject required. No buskin elevation, no tragedy pomp could mislead her, and yet poetry was poetry indeed when she read it. But if her voice was melodious when she read, it was all harmony when she sung, and the delight she gave by that, and by her skill and great compass, was heightened by the ease and gracefulness of her air and manner, and by the alacrity with which she obliged. Nevertheless, she generally chose rather to hear others sing or play, than either to play or sing herself. She delighted to give praise where deserved, yet she always bestowed it in such a manner as gave not the least suspicion that she laid out for a return of it to herself, though so universally allowed to be her due. She had a talent of saying uncommon things in such an easy manner that everybody thought they could have said the same, and which yet required both genius and observation to say them. Even severe things appeared gentle, though they lost not their force, from the sweetness of her air and utterance, and the apparent benevolence of her purpose. We form the truest judgment of persons by their behaviour on the most familiar occasions. I will give an instance or two of the correction she favoured me with on such a one. When very young, I was guilty of the fault of those who want to be courted to sing. She cured me of it at the first of our happy intimacy, by her own example, and by the following correctives, occasionally yet privately enforced. Well, my dear, shall we take you at your word? Shall we suppose that you sing but indifferently? Is not, however, the act of obliging, the company so worthy, preferable to the talent of singing? And shall not young ladies endeavour to make up for their defects in one part of education by their excellence in another? Again, you must convince us, by attempting to sing, that you cannot sing, and then we will rid you not only of present but of future importunity. An indulgence, however, let me add, that but tolerable singers do not always wish to meet with. Again, I know you will favour us by and by, and what do you by your excuses but raise our expectations, and enhance your own difficulties? At another time, has not this accomplishment been a part of your education, my Nancy? How then, for your own honour, can we allow of your excuses? And I once pleading a cold, the usual pretence of those who love to be entreated. Sing, however, my dear, as well as you can. The greater the difficulty to you, the higher the compliment to the company. Do you think you are among those who know not how to make allowances? You should sing, my love, lest there should be anybody present who may think your excuses owing to affectation. At another time, when I had truly observed that a young lady present sung better than I, and that therefore I chose not to sing before that lady, Fie, said she, drawing me on one side, is not this pride, my Nancy? Does it not look as if your principal motive to oblige was to obtain applause? A generous mind will not scruple to give advantage to a person of merit, though not always to her own advantage, and yet she will have a high merit in doing that. Supposing this excellent person absent, who, my dear, if your example spread, shall sing after you? You know every one else must be but as a foil to you. Indeed, I must have you as much superior to other ladies in these smaller points, as you are in greater. So she was pleased to say, to shame me. She was so much above reserve as disguise, so communicative that no young lady could be in her company half an hour, and not carry away instruction with her, whatever was the topic, yet all sweetly insinuated, nothing given with the air of prescription, so that while she seemed to ask a question for information's sake, she dropped in the needful instruction, and left the instructed unable to decide whether the thought, which being started she, the instructed, could improve, came primarily from herself or from the sweet instructress. She had a pretty hand at drawing, which she obtained with very little instruction. Her time was too much taken up to allow, though to so fine an art, the attention which was necessary to make her greatly excel in it, and she used to say that she was afraid of aiming at too many things, for fear she should not be tolerable at any thing. For her years and her opportunities she was an extraordinary judge of painting. In this, as in every thing else, nature was her art was nature. She even prettily performed in it. Her grandfather, for this reason, bequeathed to her all the family pictures. Charming was her fancy, alike sweet and easy was every touch of her pencil and her pen. Yet her judgment exceeded her performance. She did not practise enough to excel in the executive part. She could not in every thing excel. But upon the whole, she knew what every subject required, according to the nature of it. In other words, was an absolute mistress of the should-be. To give a familiar instance for the sake of young ladies, she, untaught, observed, when but a child, that the sun, moon, and stars never appeared at once, and were therefore never to be in one piece; that bears, tigers, lions, were not natives of an English climate, and should not therefore have place in an English landscape; that these ravagers of the forest consorted not with lambs, kids, or fawns, nor kites, hawks, and vultures, with doves, partridges, or pheasants. And, alas! she knew, before she was 19 years of age, by fatal experience she knew, that all these beasts and birds of prey were outdone in treacherous cruelty by man, vile, barbarous, plotting, destructive man, who, infinitely less excusable than those, destroys, through wantonness and sport, what those only destroy through hunger and necessity. The mere pretenders to those branches of science which she aimed at acquiring she knew how to detect, and from all nature. Propriety, another word for nature, was, as I have hinted, her law, as it is the foundation of all true judgment. But nevertheless she was always uneasy, if what she said exposed those pretenders to knowledge, even in their absence, to the ridicule of lively spirits. Let the modern ladies, who have not any one of her excellent qualities, whose whole time, in the short days they generally make, and in the inverted night and day, where they make them longer, is wholly spent in dress, visits, cards, plays, operas, and musical entertainments, wonder at what I have written, and shall further write, and let them look upon it as an incredible thing that when, at a mature age, they cannot boast one of her perfections, there should have been a lady so young, who had so many. These must be such as know not how she employed her time, and cannot form the least idea of what may be done in those hours in which they lie enveloped with the shades of death, as she used to call sleep. But before I come to mention the distribution she usually made of her time, let me say a few words upon another subject, in which she excelled all the young ladies I ever knew. This was her skill in almost all sorts of fine needleworks, of which, however, I shall say the less, since possibly you will find it mentioned in some of the letters. That piece which she bequeaths to her cousin Morden is indeed a capital piece, a performance so admirable that that gentleman's father, who resided chiefly abroad, was, as is mentioned in her will, very desirous to obtain it, in order to carry it to Italy with him, to show the curious of other countries, as he used to say, for the honour of his own, that the cloistered confinement was not necessary to make English women excel in any of those fine arts upon which nuns and recluses value themselves. Her quickness at these sort of works was astonishing, and a great encouragement to herself to prosecute them. Mr. Morden's father would have been continually making her presents, would she have permitted him to do so, and he used to call them, and so did her grandfather, tributes due to a merit so sovereign, and not presents. As to her diversions, the accomplishments and acquirements she was mistress of will show what they must have been. She was far from being fond of cards, the fashionable foible of modern ladies, nor, as will be easily perceived from what I have said, and more from what I shall further say, had she much time for play. She never therefore promoted their being called for, and often insensibly diverted the company from them by starting some entertaining subject, when she could do it without incurring the imputation of particularity. Indeed, very few of her intimates would propose cards, if they could engage her to read, to talk, to touch the keys, or to sing, when any new book or new piece of music came down. But when company was so numerous that conversation could not take that agreeable turn which it oftenest does among 4 or 5 friends of like years and inclinations, and it became in a manner necessary to detach off some of it to make the rest better company, she would not refuse to play, if, upon casting in, it fell to her lot, and then she showed that her disrelish to cards was the effect of choice only, and that she was an easy mistress of every genteel game played with them. But then she always declared against playing high. Except for trifles, she used to say, she would not submit to chance what she was already sure of. At other times, she should make her friends a very ill compliment, she said, if she supposed they would wish to be possessed of what of right belonged to her, and she should be very unworthy, if she desired to make herself a title to what was theirs. High gaming, in short, she used to say, was a sordid vice, and immorality, the child of avarice, and a direct breach of that commandment which forbids us to covet what is our neighbour's. She was exceedingly charitable, the only one of her family that knew the meaning of the word, and this with regard both to the souls and the bodies of those who were the well-chosen objects of her benevolence. She kept a list of these, whom she used to call her poor, entering one upon it as another was provided for, by death or any other way, but always made a reserve, nevertheless, for unforeseen cases, and for accidental distresses, and it must be owned that in the prudent distribution of them she had neither example nor equal. The aged, the blind, the lame, the widow, the orphan, the unsuccessful industrious, were particularly the objects of it, and the contributing to the schooling of some, to the putting out to trades and husbandry the children of others of the labouring or needy poor, and setting them forward at the expiration of their servitude, were her great delights, as was the giving good books to others, and when she had opportunity, the instructing the poorer sort of her honest neighbours and father's tenants in the use of them. That charity, she used to say, which provides for the morals, as well as for the bodily wants of the poor, gives a double benefit to the public, as it adds to the number of the hopeful what it takes from that of the profligate. And can there be, in the eyes of that God, she was wont to say, who requires nothing so much from us as acts of beneficence to one another, a charity more worthy? Her uncle Antony, when he came to settle in England with his vast fortune obtained in the Indies, used to say, this girl by her charities will bring down a blessing upon us all. And it must be owned they trusted pretty much to this presumption. But I need not say more on this head, nor perhaps was it necessary to say so much, since the charitable bequests in her will sufficiently set forth her excellence in this branch of duty. She was extremely moderate in her diet. Quantity in food, she used to say, was more to be regarded than quality, that a full meal was the great enemy both to study and industry, that a well-built house required but little repairs. But this moderation in her diet she enjoyed, with a delicate frame of body, a fine state of health, was always serene, lively, cheerful of course, and I never knew but of one illness she had, and that was by a violent cold caught in an open chaise by a sudden storm of hail and rain, in a place where was no shelter, and which threw her into a fever attended with dangerous symptoms that no doubt were lightened by her temperance, but which gave her friends, who then knew her value, infinite apprehensions for her. In her commonplace book she has the following note upon the recollection of this illness in the time of her distress. In a dangerous illness, with which I was visited a few years before I had the unhappiness to know this ungrateful man, would to heaven I had died in it, my bed was surrounded by my dear relations, father, mother, brother, sister, my 2 uncles, weeping, kneeling round me, then put up their vows to heaven for my recovery, and I, fearing that I should drag down with me to my grave one or other of my sorrowing friends, wished and prayed to recover for their sakes. Alas! how shall parents in such cases know what to wish for? How happy for them and for me had I then been denied to their prayers! But now I am eased of that care. All those dear relations are living still, but not one of them, such as they think has been the heinousness of my error, but far from being grieved, would rejoice to hear of my death. In all her readings, and her conversations upon them, she was fonder of finding beauties than blemishes, and chose to applaud but authors and books where she could find the least room for it. Yet she used to lament that certain writers of the first class, who were capable of exalting virtue, and of putting vice out of countenance, too generally employed themselves in works of imagination only, upon subjects merely speculative, disinteresting, and unedifying, from which no useful moral or example could be drawn. But she was a severe censurer of pieces of a light or indecent turn, which had a tendency to corrupt the morals of youth, to convey polluted images, or to wound religion, whether in itself or through the sides of its professors, and this whoever were the authors, and how admirable soever the execution. She often pitied the celebrated Dr. Swift for so employing his admirable pen, that a pure eye was afraid of looking into his works, and a pure ear of hearing anything quoted from them. Such authors, she used to say, were not honest to their own talents, nor grateful to the God who gave them. Nor would she, on these occasions, admit their beauties as a palliation. On the contrary, she held it as an aggravation of their crime, that they who are so capable of mending the heart should, in any places, show a corrupt one in themselves, which must weaken the influences of their good works, and pull down with one hand what they build up with the other. All she said and all she did was accompanied with a natural ease and dignity which set her above affectation, or the suspicion of it, insomuch that that degrading fault, so generally imputed to a learned woman, was never laid to her charge, for with all her excellencies she was forwarder to hear than speak, and hence, no doubt, derived no small part of her improvement. Although she was well read in the English, French, and Italian poets, and had read the best translations of the Latin classics, yet seldom did she quote or repeat from them, either in her letters or conversation, though exceedingly happy in a tenacious memory, principally through modesty, and to avoid the imputation of that affectation which I have just mentioned. Mr. Wyerley once said of her, she had such a fund of knowledge of her own, and made naturally such fine observations upon persons and things, being capable by the egg, that was his familiar expression, of judging of the bird, that she had seldom either room or necessity for foreign assistances. But it was plain from her whole conduct and behaviour that she had not so good an opinion of herself, however deserved, since, whenever she was urged to give her sentiments on any subject, although all she thought fit to say was clear and intelligible, yet she seemed in haste to have done speaking. Her reason for it, I know, was twofold, that she might not lose the benefit of other people's sentiments by engrossing the conversation, and lest, as were her words, she should be praised into loquaciousness, and so forfeit the good opinion which a person always maintains with her friends, who knows when she has said enough. It was, finally, a rule with her, to leave her hearers wishing her to say more, rather than to give them cause to show by their inattention and uneasiness that she had said so much. You are curious to know the particular distribution of her time, which you suppose will help you to account for what you own yourself surprised at, to wit, how so young a lady could make herself mistress of so many accomplishments. I will premise that she was from infancy inured to rise early in a morning by an excellent and, as I may say, a learned woman, Mrs. Norton, to whose care, wisdom, and example she was beholden for the groundwork of her taste and acquirements, which, meeting with such assistances from the divines I have named, and with such a genius, made it the less wonder that she surpassed most of her age and sex. Her sex, did I say? What honour to the other does this imply, when one might challenge the proudest pedant of them all to say he has been disciplined into greater improvement than she had made from the mere force of genius and application? But it is demonstrable to all who know how to make observations on the acquaintance of both sexes, arrogant as some are of their superficialities, that a lady at 18, take the world through, is more prudent and conversable than a man at 25. I can prove this by 19 instances out of 20 in my own knowledge. Yet how do these poor boasters value themselves upon the advantages their education gives them? Who has not seen some one of them, just come from the university, disdainfully smile at a mistaken or ill-pronounced word from a lady, when her sense has been clear, and her sentiments just, and when he could not himself utter a single sentence fit to be repeated, but what he had borrowed from the authors he had been obliged to study, as a painful exercise to slow and creeping parts? But how I digress. This excellent young lady used to say, it was incredible to think what might be done by early rising, and by long days well filled up. It may be added that she had calculated according to the practice of too many, she had actually lived more years at 16 than they had at 26. She was of opinion that no one could spend their time properly, who did not live by some rule, who did not appropriate the hours, as nearly as might be, to particular purposes and employments. In conformity to this self-set lesson, the usual distribution of the 24 hours when left to her own choice were as follows. For rest she allotted 6 hours only. She thought herself not so well and so clear in her intellects, so much alive, she used to say, if she exceeded this proportion. If she slept not, she chose to rise sooner, and in winter had her fire laid and a taper ready burning to light it, not loving to give trouble to the servants, whose harder work and later hours of going to bed, she used to say, required consideration. I have blamed her for her greater regard to them than to herself, but this was her answer: I have my choice, who can wish for more? Why should I oppress others to gratify myself? You see what free will enables one to do, while imposition would make a light burden heavy. Her first 3 morning hours were generally passed in her study and in her closet duties, and were occasionally augmented by those she saved from rest, and in these passed her epistolary amusements. 2 hours she generally allotted to domestic management. These at different times of the day, as occasions required, all the housekeeper's bills and ease of her mother passing through her hands, for she was a perfect mistress of the 4 principal rules of arithmetic. 5 hours to her needle, drawings, music, etc. In these she included the assistance and inspection she gave to her own servants, and to her sister's servants, in the needleworks required for the family. For her sister, as I have above hinted, is a modern. In these she also included Dr. Lewen's conversation visits, with whom, likewise, she held a correspondence by letters. That revered gentleman delighted himself and her twice or thrice a week, if his health permitted, with these visits, and she always preferred his company to any other engagement. 2 hours she allotted to her 2 first meals. But if conversation, or the desire of friends, or the falling in of company or guests required it to be otherwise, she never scrupled to oblige, and would on such occasions borrow, as she called it, from other distributions. And as she found it very hard not to exceed in this appropriation, she put down 1 hour more to dinner-time conversation, to be added or subtracted as occasions offered, or the desire of her friends required, and yet found it difficult, as she often said, to keep this account even, especially if Dr. Lewen obliged them with his company at their table, which, however, he seldom did, for being a valetudinarian and in a regimen, he generally made his visits in the afternoon. 1 hour to visits to the neighbouring poor, to a select number of whom, and to their children, she used to give brief instructions and good books, and as this happened not every day, and seldom above twice a week, she had 2 or 3 hours at a time to bestow in this benevolent employment. The remaining 4 hours were occasionally allotted to supper, to conversation, or to reading after supper to the family. This allotment she called her fund, upon which she used to draw, to satisfy her other debits, and in this she included visits received and returned, shows, spectacles, etc., which in a country life, not occurring every day, she used to think a great allowance, no less than 2 days in 6, for amusements only, and she was wont to say that it was hard if she could not steal time out of this fund for an excursion of even 2 or 3 days in a month. If it be said that her relations, or the young neighbouring ladies, had but little of her time, it will be considered that besides these 4 hours in the 24, great part of the time she was employed in her needleworks, she used to converse as she worked, and it was a custom she had introduced among her acquaintance, that the young ladies in their visits used frequently, in a neighbourly way, in the winter evenings especially, to bring their work with them, and one of 1/2 a dozen of her select acquaintance used by turns to read to the rest, as they were at work. This was her usual method, when at her own command, for 6 days in the week. The 7th day she kept as it ought to be kept, and as some part of it was frequently employed in works of mercy, the hour she allotted to visiting the neighbouring poor was occasionally supplied from this day, and added to her fund. But I must observe that when in her grandfather's lifetime she was 3 or 4 weeks at a time his housekeeper or guest, as also at either of her uncles, her usual distribution of time was varied, but still she had an eye to it as nearly as circumstances would admit. When I had the happiness of having her for my guest for a fortnight or so, she likewise dispensed with her rules in mere indulgence to my foibles and idler habits. For I also, though I had the benefit of an example I so much admired, am too much of a modern. Yet as to morning risings, I had corrected myself by such a precedent in the summer time, and can witness to the benefit I found by it in my health, as also to the many useful things I was enabled, by that means, with ease and pleasure, to perform. And in her account book I have found this memorandum, since her ever to be lamented death: From such a day to such a day, all holidays at my dear Miss Howe's. At her return, account resumed such a day, naming it, and then she proceeded regularly as before. Once a week she used to reckon with herself, when, if within the 144 hours contained in the 6 days she had made her account even, she noted it accordingly. If otherwise, she carried the debit to the next week's account, as thus: debtor to the article of the benevolent visits, so many hours, and so of the rest. But it was always an especial part of her care that, whether visiting or visited, she showed in all companies an entire ease, satisfaction, and cheerfulness, as if she had kept no such particular account, and as if she did not make herself answerable to herself for her occasional exceedings. This method, which to others will appear perplexing and unnecessary, her early hours and custom had made easy and pleasant to her. And indeed, as I used to tell her, greatly as I admired her in all methods, I could not bring myself to this, might I have had the world for my reward. I had indeed too much impatience in my temper to observe such a regularity in accounting between me and myself. I satisfied myself in a lump account, as I may call it, if I had nothing greatly wrong to reproach myself, when I looked back on a past week, as she had taught me to do. For she used indulgently to say, I do not think all I do necessary for another to do, nor even for myself. But when it is more pleasant for me to keep such an account than to let it alone, why may I not proceed in my supererogatories? There can be no harm in it. It keeps up my attention to accounts, which one day may be of use to me in more material instances. Those who will not keep a strict account seldom long keep any. I neglect not more useful employments for it. And it teaches me to be covetous of time, the only thing of which we can be allowably covetous, since we live but once in this world, and when gone, are gone from it for ever. She always reconciled the necessity, under which these interventions, as she called them, laid her, of now and then breaking into some of her appropriations, saying, that was good sense, and good manners too, in the common lesson, when at Rome, do as they do at Rome; and that to be easy of persuasion in matters where one could oblige without endangering virtue or worthy habits, was an apostolical excellency, since, if a person conformed with a view of making herself an interest in her friends' affections, in order to be heeded in greater points, it was imitating his example, who became all things to all men, that he might gain some. Nor is it to be doubted, had life been spared her, that the sweetness of her temper and her cheerful piety would have made virtue and religion appear so lovely, that her example would have had no small influence upon the minds and manners of those who would have had the honour of conversing with her. Oh, Mr. Belford, I can write no further on this subject, for looking into the account book for other particulars, I met with a most affecting memorandum, which being written on the extreme edge of the paper with a fine pen, and in the dear creature's smallest hand, I saw not before. This it is, written, I suppose, at some calamitous period after the day named in it. Help me to curse, to blast the monster who gave occasion for it. April 10th, the account concluded, and with it all my worldly hopes and prospects. I take up my pen, but not to apologize for my execration. Once more I pray to God to avenge me of him. Me, I say, for mine is the loss, hers the gain. O sir, you could not know her as I knew her. Never was such an excellence, so warm yet so cool a friend, so much what I wish to be, but never shall be. For, alas, my stay, my adviser, my monitress, my directress is gone, for ever gone. She honoured me with the title of the sister of her heart, but I was only so in the love I bore her, a love beyond a sister's, infinitely beyond her sister's, in the hatred I have to every mean and sordid action, and in my love of virtue, for otherwise I am of a high and haughty temper, as I have acknowledged heretofore, and very violent in my passions. In short, she was the nearest perfection of any creature I ever knew. She never preached to me lessons which she practised not herself. She lived the life she taught. All humility, meekness, self-accusing, others acquitting, though the shadow of the fault was hardly hers, the substance theirs, whose only honour was their relation to her. To lose such a friend, such a guide! If ever my violence was justifiable, it is upon this recollection, for she lived only to make me sensible of my failings, but not long enough to enable me to conquer them, as I was resolved to endeavour to do. Once more, then, let me execrate. But now violence and passion again predominate. And how can it be otherwise? But I force myself from the subject, having lost the purpose for which I resume my pen. A. Howe. End of Letter 55. Letter 56 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 56. Mr. Lovelace to John Belford, Esquire, Paris, October 14th. Timor et minae scandunt eodum quo dominus, neque decedit aerata triremi, et post equitem sedet atra cura. In a language so expressive as the English, I hate the pedantry of tagging or prefacing what I write with Latin scraps, and ever was a censor of the motto-mongers among our weekly and daily scribblers. But these verses of Horace are so applicable to my case that, whether on shipboard, whether in my post-chaise, or in my inn at night, I am not able to put them out of my head. Dryden once, I thought, said very well in these bouncing lines: Man makes his fate according to his mind. The weak, low spirit Fortune makes her slave, But she's a drudge when hectored by the brave. If fate weave common thread, I'll change the doom, And with new purple weave a nobler loom. And in these: Let Fortune empty her whole quiver on me. I have a soul that, like an ample shield, Can take in all, and verge enough for more. Fate was not mine, nor am I fate's. Souls know no conquerors. But in the first quoted lines, considering them closely, there is nothing but blustering absurdity. In the other, the poet says not truth, for conscience is the conqueror of souls. At least, it is the conqueror of mine, and who ever thought it a narrow one? But this is occasioned partly by poring over the affecting will and posthumous letter. What an army of texts has she drawn up in array against me in the letter! But yet, Jack, do they not show me that 2,000 or 3,000 years ago there were as wicked fellows as myself? They do. And that's some consolation. But the generosity of her mind displayed in both is what stings me most, and the more still as it is now out of my power any way in the world to be even with her. I ought to have written to you sooner, but I loitered 2 days at Calais, for an answer to a letter I wrote to engage my former travelling valet, de la Tour. An ingenious ready fellow, as you have heard me say. I have engaged him, and he is now with me. I shall make no stay here, but intend for some of the electoral courts. That of Bavaria, I think, will engage me longest. Perhaps I may step out of my way, if I can be out of my way anywhere, to those of Dresden and Berlin. And it is not impossible that you may have one letter from me at Vienna. And then, perhaps, I may fall down into Italy by the Tyrol, and so, taking Turin in my way, return to Paris, where I hope to see Mowbray and Tourville, nor do I despair of you. This a good deal differs from the plan I gave you, but you may expect to hear from me as I move, and whether I shall pursue this route or the other. I have my former lodgings in the Rue Saint Antoine, which I shall hold, notwithstanding my tour, so they will be ready to accommodate any two of you, if you come hither before my return, and for this I have conditioned. I write to Charlotte, and that is writing to all my relations at once. Do thou, Jack, inform me duly of every thing that passes, particularly how thou proceedest in thy reformation scheme, how Mowbray and Tourville go on in my absence, whether thou hast any chance for a wife. I am the more solicitous on this head, because thou seemest to think that thy mortification will not be complete, nor thy reformation secure, till thou art shackled. How the Harlowes proceed in their penitentials, if Miss Howe be married, or near being so, how honest Elman goes on with his empiric, now he has dismissed his regulars, or they him, and if any likelihood of his perfect recovery. Be sure be very minute, for every trifling occurrence relating to those we value becomes interesting, when we are at a distance from them. Finally, prepare thou to piece thy broken thread, if thou wouldst oblige thy Lovelace. End of Letter 56. Letter 57 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 57. Mr. Belford to Robert Lovelace, Esq. London, October 25th. I write to show you that I am incapable of slighting even the minutest requests of an absent and distant friend. Yet you may believe that there cannot be any great alterations in the little time that you have been out of England, with respect to the subjects of your inquiry. Nevertheless, I will answer to each, for the reason above given, and for the reason you mentioned that even trifles and chit-chat are agreeable from friend to friend, and of friends, and even of those to whom we give the importance of deeming them our foes when we are abroad. First, then, as to my reformation scheme, as you call it, I hope I go on very well. I wish you had entered upon the like, and could say so too. You would then find infinitely more peace of mind than you are likely ever otherwise to be acquainted with. When I look back upon the sweep that has been made among us in the 2 or 3 past years, and forward upon what may still happen, I hardly think myself secure, though of late I have been guided by other lights than those of sense and appetite, which have hurried so many of our confraternity into worldly ruin, if not into eternal perdition. I am very earnest in my wishes to be admitted into the nuptial state, but I think I ought to pass some time as a probationary, till by steadiness in my good resolutions I can convince some woman, whom I could love and honour, and whose worthy example might confirm my morals, that there is one libertine who had the grace to reform, before age or disease put it out of his power to sin on. The Harlowes continue inconsolable, and I dare say will to the end of their lives. Miss Howe is not yet married, but I have reason to think will soon. I have the honour of corresponding with her, and the more I know of her, the more I admire the nobleness of her mind. She must be conscious that she is superior to half our sex, and to most of her own, which may make her give way to a temper naturally hasty and impatient. But if she meet with condescension in her man, and who would not vail to a superiority so visible, if it be not exacted with arrogance, I dare say she will make an excellent wife. As to Dolman, the poor man goes on trying and hoping with his empiric. I cannot but say that as the latter is a sensible and judicious man, and not rash, opinionative, or over-sanguine, I have great hopes, little as I think of quacks and nostrum-mongers in general, that he will do him good, if his case will admit of it. My reasons are, that the man pays a regular and constant attendance upon him, watches with his own eye every change and new symptom of his patient's malady, varies his applications as the indications vary, fetters not himself to rules laid down by the fathers of the art, who lived many 100 years ago, when diseases and the causes of them were different, as the modes of living were different from what they are now, as well as climates and accidents, that he is to have his reward not in daily fees, but, after the first 5 guineas for medicines, in proportion as the patient himself shall find amendment. As to Mowbray and Tourville, what novelties can be expected in so short a time from men who have not sense enough to strike out or pursue new lights, either good or bad, now especially that you are gone, who were the soul of all enterprise, and in particular their soul? Besides, I see them but seldom. I suppose they'll be at Paris before you can return from Germany, for they cannot live without you; and you gave them such a specimen of your recovered volatility in the last evening's conversation as delighted them, and concerned me. I wish with all my heart that thou wouldst bend thy course toward the Pyreneans. I should then, if thou writest to thy cousin Montague an account of what is most observable in thy tour, put in for a copy of thy letters. I wonder thou wilt not, since then thy subjects would be as new to thyself as to thy Belford. End of Letter 57. Letter 58 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 58. Mr. Lovelace to John Belford, Esquire, Paris, October 16th to 27th. I follow my last of the 25th of October, on occasion of a letter just now come to hand from Joseph Leman. The fellow is conscience-ridden, Jack, and tells me that he cannot rest either day or night for the mischiefs which he fears he has been, or may still further be the means of doing. He wishes, if it please God, and if it please me, that he had never seen my Honour's face. And what is the cause of his present concern, as to his own particular? What but the slights and contempts which he receives from every one of the Harlowes, from those particularly, he says, whom he has endeavoured to serve as faithfully as his engagements to me would let him serve them? And I always made him believe, he tells me, poor weak soul as he was from his cradle, that serving me was serving both, in the long run. But this, and the death of his dear young lady, is a grief, he declares, that he shall never claw off, were he to live to the age of Matthew Salem, alt-off and howsomever, he is sure, that he shall not live a month to an end, being strangely pined, and his stomach nothing like what it was, and Mrs. Betty being also, now she has got his love, very cross and slighting. But thank his God for punishing her. She is in a poor way herself. But the chief occasion of troubling my Honour now is not his own griefs only, although they are very great, but to prevent further mischiefs to me, for he can assure me that Colonel Morden has set out from them all, with a full resolution to have his will of me, and he is well assured that he said and swore to it, as how he was resolved that he would either have my Honour's heart's blood, or I should have his, or some such like sad threatenings, and that all the family rejoice in it, and hope I shall come short home. This is the substance of Joseph's letter, and I have one from Mowbray, which has a hint to the same effect. And I recollect now that you were very importunate with me to go to Madrid, rather than to France and Italy, the last evening we passed together. What I desire of you is by the first dispatch to let me faithfully know all that you know on this head. I can't bear to be threatened, Jack, nor shall any man unquestioned give himself airs in my absence, if I know it, that shall make me look mean in any body's eyes, that shall give friends pain for me, that shall put them upon wishing me to change my intentions or my plan, to avoid him. Upon such despicable terms as these, think you that I could bear to live? But why, if such were his purpose, did he not let me know it before I left England? Was he unable to work himself up to a resolution till he knew me to be out of the kingdom? As soon as I can inform myself where to direct to him, I will write to know his purpose, For I cannot bear suspense in such a case as this. That solemn act, were it even to be marriage or hanging, which must be done to morrow, I had rather should be done to day. My mind tires and sickens with impatience, on ruminating upon scenes that can afford neither variety nor certainty. To dwell 20 days in expectation of an even that may be decided in a quarter of an hour is grievous. If he come to Paris, or if I should be on my tour, he will very easily find out my lodgings; for I every day see some one or other of my countrymen, and divers of them have I entertained here. I go frequently to the opera and to the play, and appear at court, and at all public places; and, on my quitting this city, will leave a direction whither my letters from England or elsewhere shall from time to time be forwarded. Were I sure that his intention is what Joseph Leman tells me it is, I would stay here, or shorten his course to me, let him be where he would. I cannot get off my regrets on account of this dear lady for the blood of me. If the Colonel and I are to meet, as he has done me no injury, and loves the memory of his cousin, we shall engage with the same sentiments as to the object of our dispute; and that, you know, is no very common case. In short, I am as much convinced that I have done wrong as he can be, and regret it as much. But I will not bear to be threatened by any man in the world, however conscious I may be of having deserved blame. Adieu, Belford. Be sincere with me. No palliation, as thou valuest. Thy Lovelace. End of Letter 58. Letter 59 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Vol. 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Vol. 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 59. Mr. Belford, to Robert Lovelace, Esq. London, October 26. I cannot think, my dear Lovelace, that Colonel Morden has either threatened you in those gross terms mentioned by the vile Joseph Leman, or intends to follow you. They are the words of people of that fellow's class, and not of a gentleman; not of Colonel Morden, I am sure. You'll observe that Joseph pretends not to say that he heard him speak them. I have been very solicitous to sound the Colonel for your sake and for his own, and for the sake of the injunctions of the excellent lady to me, as well as to him, on that subject. He is, and you will not wonder that he should be, extremely affected, and owns that he has expressed himself in terms of resentment on the occasion. Once he said to me, that had his beloved cousin's case been that of a common seduction, her own credulity or weakness contributing to her fall, he could have forgiven you. But in so many words he assured me that he had not taken any resolutions, nor had he declared himself to the family in such a way as should bind him to resent. On the contrary, he has owned, that his cousin's injunctions have hitherto had the force upon him which I could wish they should have. He went abroad in a week after you. When he took his leave of me, he told me that his design was to go to Florence, and that he would settle his affairs there, and then return to England, and here pass the remainder of his days. I was indeed apprehensive that, if you and he were to meet, something unhappy might fall out. And as I knew that you proposed to take Italy, and very likely Florence, in your return to France, I was very solicitous to prevail upon you to take the court of Spain into your plan. I am still so. And if you are not to be prevailed upon to do that, let me entreat you to avoid Florence or Leghorn in your returns, since you have visited both heretofore. At least, let not the proposal of a meeting come from you. It would be matter of serious reflection to me, if the very fellow, this Joseph Leman, who gave you such an opportunity to turn all the artillery of his masters against themselves, and to play them upon one another to favour your plotting purposes, should be the instrument, in the devil's hand, unwittingly too, to avenge them all upon you. For should you even get the better of the Colonel, would the mischief end there? It would but add remorse to your present remorse, since the interview must end in death, for he would not, I am confident, take his life at your hand. The Harlowes would, moreover, prosecute you in a legal way. You hate them, and they would be gainers by his death, rejoicers in yours. And have you not done mischief enough already? Let me, therefore, and through me all your friends, have the satisfaction to hear that you are resolved to avoid this gentleman. Time will subdue all things. Nobody doubts your bravery, nor will it be known that your plan is changed through persuasion. Young Harlowe talks of calling you to account. This is a plain evidence that Mr. Morden has not taken the quarrel upon himself for their family. I am in no apprehension of any body but Colonel Morden. I know it will not be a mean to prevail upon you to oblige me, if I say that I am well assured that this gentleman is a skilful swordsman, and that he is as cool and sedate as skilful. But yet I will add, that, if I had a value for my life, he should be the last man, except yourself, with whom I would choose to have a contention. I have, as you required, been very candid and sincere with you. I have not aimed at palliation. If you seek not Colonel Morden, it is my opinion he will not seek you, for he is a man of principle. But if you seek him, I believe he will not shun you. Let me re-urge, it is the effect of my love for you,
that you know your own guilt in this affair, and should not be again an aggressor. It would be pity that so brave a man as the Colonel should drop, were you and he to meet. And on the other hand, it would be dreadful that you should be sent to your account unprepared for it, and pursuing a fresh violence. Moreover, seest thou not, in the deaths of 2 of thy principal agents, the handwriting upon the wall against thee? My zeal on this occasion may make me guilty of repetition. Indeed I know not how to quit the subject. But if what I have written, added to your own remorse and consciousness, cannot prevail, all that I might further urge would be ineffectual. Adieu, therefore. Mayest thou repent of the past, and may no new violences add to thy heavy reflections, and overwhelm thy future hopes, are the wishes of thy true friend, John Belford. End of Letter 59. Letter 60 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 60. Mr. Lovelace to John Belford, Esq., Munich, November 11th to 22nd. I received yours this moment, just as I was setting out for Vienna. As to going to Madrid, or one single step out of the way to avoid Colonel Morden, let me perish if I do. You cannot think me so mean a wretch. And so you own that he has threatened me, but not in gross and ungentlemanly terms, you say. If he has threatened me like a gentleman, I will resent his threats like a gentleman. But he has not done as a man of honour, if he has threatened at all behind my back. I would scorn to threaten any man to whom I knew how to address myself, either personally or by pen and ink. As to what you mention of my guilt, of the handwriting on the wall, of a legal prosecution if he meet his fate from my hand, of his skill, coolness, courage, and such like paltry stuff, what can you mean by it? Surely you cannot believe that such insinuations as those will weaken either my hands or my heart. No more of this sort of nonsense, I beseech you, in any of your future letters. He had not taken any resolutions, you say, when you saw him. He must and will take resolutions, one way or other, very quickly, for I wrote to him yesterday, without waiting for this or your answer to my last. I could not avoid it. I could not, as I told you in that, live in suspense. I have directed my letter to Florence. Nor could I suffer my friends to live in suspense as to my safety. But I have couched it in such moderate terms that he has fairly his option. He will be the challenger, if he take it in the sense in which he may so handsomely avoid taking it. And if he does, it will demonstrate that malice and revenge were the predominant passions with him, and that he was determined but to settle his affairs, and then take his resolutions, as you phrase it. Yet, if we are to meet, for I know what my option would be, in his case, on such a letter, complaisant as it is, I wish he had a worse, I, a better cause. It would be a sweet revenge to him, were I to fall by his hand. But what should I be the better for killing him? I will enclose a copy of the letter I sent him. On reperusing yours in a cooler moment, I cannot but thank you for your friendly love and good intentions. My value for you, from the first hour of our acquaintance till now, I have never found misplaced. Regarding at least your intention, thou must, however, own a good deal of blunder of the overdo and underdo kind, with respect to the part thou actest between me and the beloved of my heart. But thou art really an honest fellow, and a sincere and warm friend. I could almost wish I had not written to Florence till I had received thy letter now before me. But it is gone. Let it go. If he wish peace and to avoid violence, he will have a fair opportunity to embrace the one and shun the other. If not, he must take his fate. But be this as it may, you may contrive to let young Harlowe know, he is a minister too, that I shall be in England in March next at furthest. This of Bavaria is a gallant and polite court. Nevertheless, being uncertain whether my letter may meet with the Colonel at Florence, I shall quit it and set out as I intended for Vienna, taking care to have any letter or message from him conveyed to me there, which will soon bring me back hither, or to any other place to which I shall be invited. As I write to Charlotte, I have nothing more to add, after compliments to all friends, than that I am, wholly yours, Lovelace. Mr. Lovelace to William Morden, Esq., enclosed in the above, Munich, November 10th to 21st. Sir, I have heard with a great deal of surprise that you have thought fit to throw out some menacing expressions against me. I should have been very glad that you had thought I had punishment enough in my own mind for the wrongs I have done to the most excellent of women, and that it had been possible for two persons, so ardently joining in one love, especially as I was desirous to the utmost of my power to repair those wrongs, to have lived, if not on amicable terms, in such a way as not to put either to the pain of hearing of threatenings thrown out in absence, which either ought to be despised for, if he had not spirit to take notice of them. Now, Sir, if what I have heard be owing only to warmth of temper or to sudden passion, while the loss, of all other losses the most deplorable to me, was recent, I not only excuse but commend you for it. But if you are really determined to meet me on any other account, which I own to you is not however what I wish, it would be very blameable, and very unworthy of the character I desire to maintain, as well with you as with every other gentleman, to give you a difficulty in doing it. Being uncertain when this letter may meet you, I shall set out to-morrow for Vienna, where any letter directed to the post-house in the city, or to Baron Winskratz at the Favorita, to whom I have commendations, will come to hand. Meantime, believing you to be a man too generous to make a wrong construction of what I am going to declare, and knowing the value which the dearest of all creatures had for you, and your relation to her, I will not scruple to assure you that the most acceptable return will be, that Colonel Morden chooses to be upon an amicable, rather than upon any other footing, with his sincere admirer and humble servant, R. Lovelace. End of Letter 60. Letter 61 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 61. Mr. Lovelace to John Belford, Esq., Linz, November 28th, December 9th. I am now on my way to Trent, in order to meet Colonel Morden, in pursuance of his answer to my letter enclosed in my last. I had been at Pressburg, and had intended to visit some other cities of Hungary, but having obliged myself to return first to Vienna, I there met with his letter, which follows. Munich, November 21st, December 2nd. Sir, your letter was at Florence 4 days before I arrived there. That I might not appear unworthy of your favour, I set out for this city the very next morning. I knew not but that the politeness of this court might have engaged, beyond his intention, a gentleman who has only his pleasure to pursue. But being disappointed in my hope of finding you here, it becomes me to acquaint you, that I have such a desire to stand well in the opinion of a man of your spirit, that I cannot hesitate a moment upon the option, which I am sure Mr. Lovelace, in my situation, thus called upon, would make. I own, sir, that I have on all occasions spoken of your treatment of my ever dear cousin as it deserved. It would have been very surprising if I had not. And it behoves me, now you have given me so noble an opportunity of explaining myself, to convince you that no words fell from my lips of you merely because you were absent. I acquaint you, therefore, that I will attend your appointment, and would, were it to the furthest part of the globe. I shall stay some days at this court, and if you please to direct for me at M. Kleinfurt's in this city, whether I remain here or not, your commands will come safely and speedily to the hands of Sir, your most humble servant, William Morden. So you see, Belford, that the Colonel by his ready, his even eagerly expressed acceptance of the offered interview, was determined. And is it not much better to bring such a point as this to an issue, than to give pain to friends for my safety, or continue in suspense myself, as I must do, if I imagine that another had aught against me? This was my reply. Vienna, November 25th, December 6th. Sir, I have this moment the favour of yours. I will suspend a tour I was going to take into Hungary, and instantly set out for Munich; and if I can find you not there, will proceed on to Trent. This city, being on the confines of Italy, will be most convenient, as I presume, to you, in your return to Tuscany, and I shall hope to meet you in it on the 3rd to 14th of December. I shall bring with me only a French valet and an English footman. Other particulars may be adjusted when I have the honour to see you. Till when, I am, Sir, your most obedient servant, R. Lovelace. Now, Jack, I have no manner of apprehension of the event of this meeting, and I think I must say he seeks me out, not I him, and so let him take the consequence. What is infinitely nearer to my heart is my ingratitude to the most excellent of women, my premeditated ingratitude, yet all the while enabled to distinguish and to adore her excellencies, in spite of the mean opinion of the sex which I had imbibed from early manhood. But this lady has asserted the worthiness of her sex, and most gloriously has she exalted it with me now. Yet surely, as I have said and written 100 times, there cannot be such another woman. But as my loss in her departure is the greatest of any man's, and as she was dearer to me than to any other person in the world, and once she herself wished to be so, what an insolence in any man breathing to pretend to avenge her on me! Happy, happy, thrice happy, had I known how to value, as I ought to have valued, the glory of such a preference. I will not aggravate to myself this aggravation of the Colonel's pretending to call me to account for my treatment of a lady so much my own, lest, in the approaching interview, my heart should relent for one so nearly related to her, and who means honour and justice to her memory, and I should thereby give him advantages which otherwise he cannot have. For I know that I shall be inclined to trust to my skill, to save a man who was so much and so justly valued by her, and shall be loath to give way to my resentment, as a threatened man, and in this respect only I am sorry for his skill and his courage, lest I should be obliged, in my own defence, to add a chalk to a score that is already too long. Indeed, Belford, I am, and shall be, to my latest hour, the most miserable of beings. Such exalted generosity! Why didst thou put into my craving hands the copy of her will? Why sentest thou to me the posthumous letter? What though I was earnest to see the will? Thou knewest what they both were, I did not, and that it would be cruel to oblige me. The meeting of 20 Colonel Mordens, were there 20 to meet in turn, would be nothing to me, would not give me a moment's concern as to my own safety. But my reflections upon my vile ingratitude to so superior an excellence will ever be my curse. Had she been a Miss Howe to me, and treated me as if I were a Hickman, I had had a call for revenge; and policy, when I had intended to be an husband, might have justified my attempts to humble her. But a meek and gentle temper was hers, though a true heroine, whenever honour or virtue called for an exertion of spirit. Nothing but my cursed devices stood in the way of my happiness. Rememberest thou not how repeatedly from the first I poured cold water upon her rising flame, by meanly and ungratefully turning upon her the injunctions which virgin delicacy and filial duty induced her to lay me under, before I got her into my power? Did she not tell me, and did I not know it, if she had not told me, that she could not be guilty of affectation or tyranny to the man whom she intended to marry? I knew, as she once upbraided me, that from the time I had got her from her father's house, I had a plain path before me. True did she say, and I triumphed in the discovery, that from that time I held her soul in suspense 100 times. My ipecacuanha trial alone was enough to convince an infidel that she had a mind in which love and tenderness would have presided, had I permitted the charming buds to put forth and blow. She would have had no reserve, as once she told me, had I given her cause for doubt. And did she not own to thee, that once she could have loved me, and could she have made me good, would have made me happy? O Belford, here was love! A love of the noblest kind; a love, as she hints in her posthumous letter, that extended to the soul; and which she not only avowed in her dying hours, but contrived to let me know it after death, in that letter filled with warnings and exhortations, which had for their sole end my eternal welfare. The cursed women indeed endeavoured to excite my vengeance and my pride, by preaching to me of me; and my pride was at times too much excited by their vile insinuations. But had it even been as they said, well might she, who had been used to be courted and admired by every desiring eye, and worshipped by every respectful heart, well might such a woman be allowed to draw back, when she found herself kept in suspense as to the great question of all, by a designing and intriguing spirit, pretending awe and distance as reasons for reining in a fervour which, if real, cannot be reined in. Divine creature! Her very doubts, her reserves, so justly doubting, would have been my assurance and my glory. And what other trial needed her virtue? What other needed a purity so angelic, blessed with such a command in her passions in the bloom of youth, had I not been a villain, and a wanton, a conceited, a proud fool, as well as a villain? These reflections sharpened, rather than their edge by time abated, accompany me in whatever I do, and wherever I go, and mingle with all my diversions and amusements. And yet I go into gay and splendid company. I have made new acquaintance in the different courts I have visited. I am both esteemed and sought after by persons of rank and merit. I visit the colleges, the churches, the palaces. I frequent the theatre, am present at every public exhibition, and see all that is worth seeing that I had not seen before. In the cabinets of the curious. Am sometimes admitted to the toilette of an eminent toast, and make one with distinction at the assemblies of others. Yet can think of nothing, nor of any body with delight, but of my Clarissa. Nor have I seen one woman with advantage to herself, but as she resembles in stature, air, complexion, voice, or in some feature, that charmer, that only charmer of my soul. What greater punishment than to have these astonishing perfections, which she was mistress of, strike my remembrance with such force, when I have nothing left me but the remorse of having deprived myself and the world of such a blessing? Now and then, indeed, am I capable of a gleam of comfort, arising, not ungenerously, from the moral certainty which I have of her everlasting happiness, in spite of all the machinations and devices which I set on foot to ensnare her virtue, and to bring down so pure a mind to my own level. For can I be, at worst, avert that worst, O thou supreme, who only canst avert it, so much a wretch, so very far abandoned, but that I must, even in the horrid gloom, reap intervenient joy, at least some respite, from pain and anguish, in her bliss? If I find myself thus miserable abroad, I will soon return to England, and follow your example, I think. Turn hermit, or some plaguy thing or other, and see what a constant course of penitence and mortification will do for me. There is no living at this rate. Damn me if there be. If any mishap should befall me, you'll have the particulars of it from De la Tour. He indeed knows but little English, but every modern tongue is yours.
He is a trusty and ingenious fellow, and if any thing happen, will have some other papers, which I have already sealed up, for you to transmit to Lord M. And since thou art so expert and so ready at executorships, pr'ythee, Belford, accept of the office for me, as well as for my Clarissa Lovelace, let me call her. By all that's good, I am bewitched to her memory. Her very name, with mine joined to it, ravishes my soul, and is more delightful to me than the sweetest music. Had I carried her, I must still recriminate, to any other place than that accursed woman's, for the potion was her invention and mixture, and all the persisted in violence was at her instigation, and at that of her wretched daughters, who have now amply revenged upon me their own ruin, which they lay at my door. But this looks so like the confession of a thief at the gallows, that possibly thou wilt be apt to think I am intimidated in prospect of the approaching interview. But far otherwise. On the contrary, most cheerfully do I go to meet the Colonel, and I would tear my heart out of my breast with my own hands, were it capable of fear or concern on that account. Thus much only I know, that if I should kill him, which I will not do if I can help it, I shall be far from being easy in my mind. That shall I never more be. But as the meeting is evidently of his own seeking, against an option fairly given to the contrary, and I cannot avoid it, I'll think of that hereafter. It is but repenting and mortifying for all at once. For I am sure of victory, as I am that I now live, let him be ever so skilful a swordsman, since, besides that I am no unfleshed novice, this is a sport that, when provoked to it, I love as well as my food. And moreover I shall be as calm and undisturbed as the bishop at his prayers, while he, as is evident by his letter, must be actuated by revenge and passion. Doubt not therefore, Jack, that I shall give good account of this affair. Meantime I remain yours most affectionately, etc. Lovelace. End of Letter 61. Letter 62 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 62. Mr. Lovelace to John Belford, Esq., Trent, December 3rd to 14th. To-morrow is to be the day that will, in all probability, send either one or two ghosts to attend the manes of my Clarissa. I arrived here yesterday, and inquiring for an English gentleman of the name of Morden, soon found out the Colonel's lodgings. He had been in town 2 days, and left his name at every probable place. He was gone to ride out, and I left my name and where to be found, and in the evening he made me a visit. He was plaguy gloomy. That was not I. But yet he told me that I had acted like a man of true spirit in my first letter, and with honour, in giving him so readily this meeting. He wished I had in other respects, and then we might have seen each other upon better terms than now we did. I said there was no recalling what was past, and that I wished some things had not been done as well as he. To recriminate now, he said, would be as exasperating as unavailable, and as I had so cheerfully given him this opportunity, words should give place to business. Your choice, Mr. Lovelace, of time, of place, of weapon, shall be my choice. The two latter be yours, Mr. Morden. The time to-morrow, or next day, as you please. Next day then, Mr. Lovelace, and we'll ride out to-morrow to fix the place. Agreed, sir. Well, now, Mr. Lovelace, do you choose the weapon? I said I believed we might be upon an equal footing with the single rapier, but if he thought otherwise, I had no objection to a pistol. I will only say, replied he, that the chances may be more equal by the sword, because we can neither of us be to seek in that, and you would stand, says he, a worse chance, as I apprehend, with a pistol. And yet I have brought two, that you may take your choice of either. For, added he, I have never missed a mark at pistol distance, since I knew how to hold a pistol. I told him that he spoke like himself, that I was expert enough that way to embrace it if he chose it, though not so sure of my mark as he pretended to be. Yet the devil's in it, Colonel, if I, who have slit a bullet in two upon a knife's edge, hit not my man. So I have no objection to a pistol, if it be your choice. No man, I'll venture to say, has a steadier hand or eye than I have. They may both be of use to you, sir, at the sword as well as at the pistol. The sword, therefore, be the thing, if you please. With all my heart. We parted with a solemn sort of ceremonious civility, and this day I called upon him, and we rode out together to fix upon the place. And both being of one mind, and hating to put off for the morrow what could be done to day, would have decided it then. But de la Tour and the Colonel's valet, who attended us, being unavoidably let into the secret, joined to beg we would have with us a surgeon from Brixton, whom La Tour had fallen in with there, and who had told him he was to ride next morning to bleed a person in a fever at a lone cottage, which, by the surgeon's description, was not far from the place where we then were, if it were not that very cottage within sight of us. They overtook so to manage it, that the surgeon should know nothing of the matter till his assistance was called in; and La Tour, being, as I assured the Colonel, a ready contriving fellow, whom I ordered to obey him as myself, were the chance to be in his favour, We both agreed to defer the decision till to-morrow, and to leave the whole about the surgeon to the management of our two valets, enjoining them absolute secrecy, and so rode back again by different ways. We fixed upon a little lone valley for the spot, 10 to-morrow morning the time, and single rapier the word. Yet I repeatedly told him that I valued myself so much upon my skill in that weapon, that I would wish him to choose any other. He said it was a gentleman's weapon, and he who understood it not wanted a qualification that he ought to suffer for not having, but that, as to him, one weapon was as good as another throughout all the instruments of offence. So, Jack, you see I take no advantage of him, but my devil must deceive me if he take not his life or his death at my hands before 11 to-morrow morning. His valet and mine are to be present, but both strictly enjoined to be impartial and inactive, and in return for my civility of the like nature, he commanded his to be assisting me, if he fell. We are to ride thither, and to dismount when at the place, and his footman and mine are to wait at an appointed distance, with a chaise to carry off to the borders of the Venetian territories the survivor, if one drop, or to assist either or both, as occasion may demand. And thus, Belford, is the matter settled. A shower of rain has left me nothing else to do, and therefore I write this letter, though I might as well have deferred it till to-morrow 12 o'clock, when I doubt not to be able to write again, to assure you much I am yours, etc. Lovelace. End of letter 62. Letter 63 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 63. Translation of a letter from F. J. de la Tour to John Belford, Esq., near Soho Square, London, Trent, December 18th. N.S. Sir, I have melancholy news to inform you of, by order of the Chevalier Lovelace. He showed me his letter to you before he sealed it, signifying that he was to meet the Chevalier Morden on the 15th. Wherefore, as the occasion of the meeting is so well known to you, I shall say nothing of it here. I had taken care to have ready, within a little distance, a surgeon and his assistant, to whom, under an oath of secrecy, I had revealed the matter, though I did not own it to the two gentlemen, so that they were prepared with bandages and all things proper. For well was I acquainted with the bravery and skill of my Chevalier, and had heard the character of the other, and knew the animosity of both. A post-chaise was ready, with each of their footmen, at a little distance. The two Chevaliers came exactly at their time. They were attended by Monsieur Margate, the Colonel's gentleman, and myself. They had given orders overnight, and now repeated them in each other's presence, that we should observe a strict impartiality between them, and that if one fell, each of us should look upon himself, as to any needful help or retreat, as the servant of the survivor, and take his commands accordingly. After a few compliments, both the gentlemen, with the greatest presence of mind that I ever beheld in men, stripped to their shirts, and drew. They parried with equal judgment several passes. My Chevalier drew the first blood, making a desperate push, which, by a sudden turn of his antagonist, missed going clear through him, and wounded him on the fleshy part of the ribs of his right side, which part the sword tore out, being on the extremity of the body. But before my Chevalier could recover himself, the Colonel, in return, pushed him into the inside of the left arm, near the shoulder, and the sword, raking his breast as it passed, being followed by a great effusion of blood, the Colonel said, Sir, I believe you have enough. My Chevalier swore, by God he was not hurt. 'Twas a pin's point, and so made another pass at his antagonist, which he, with a surprising dexterity, received under his arm, and run my dear Chevalier into the body, who immediately fell, saying, The luck is yours, sir. O my beloved Clarissa! Now art thou. Inwardly he spoke 3 or 4 words more. His sword dropped from his hand. Mr. Morden threw his down, and ran to him, saying in French, Ah, monsieur, you are a dead man. Call to God for mercy. We gave the signal agreed upon to the footmen, and they to the surgeons, who instantly came up. Colonel Morden, I found, was too well used to the bloody work, for he was as cool as if nothing extraordinary had happened, assisting the surgeons, though his own wound bled much. But my dear Chevalier fainted away 2 or 3 times running, and vomited blood besides. However, they stopped the bleeding for the present, and we helped him into the voiture, and then the Colonel suffered his own wound to be dressed, and appeared concerned that my Chevalier was between whiles, when he could speak and struggle, extremely outrageous. Poor gentleman! He had made quite sure of victory. The Colonel, against the surgeon's advice, would mount on horseback to pass into the Venetian territories, and generously gave me a purse of gold to pay the surgeons, desiring me to make a present to the footman, and to accept of the remainder as a mark of his satisfaction in my conduct, and in my care and tenderness of my master. The surgeons told him that my chevalier could not live over the day. When the Colonel took leave of him, Mr. Lovelace said, You have well revenged the dear creature. I have, Sir, said Mr. Morden, and perhaps shall be sorry that you called upon me to this work, while I was balancing whether to obey or disobey the dear angel. There is a fate in it, replied my chevalier, a cursed fate, or this could not have been. But be ye all witnesses, that I have provoked my destiny, and acknowledge that I fall by a man of honour. Sir, said the Colonel, with the piety of a confessor, wringing Mr. Lovelace's hand, snatch these few fleeting moments, and commend yourself to God. And so he rode off. The voiture proceeded slowly with my chevalier, yet the motion set both his wounds bleeding afresh, and it was with difficulty they again stopped the blood. We brought him alive to the nearest cottage, and he gave orders to me to dispatch to you the packet I herewith send sealed up, and bid me write to you the particulars of this most unhappy affair, and give you thanks in his name for all your favours and friendship to him. Contrary to all expectation, he lived over the night, but suffered much, as well from his impatience and disappointment as from his wounds, for he seemed very unwilling to die. He was delirious at times in the 2 last hours, and then several times cried out, as if he had seen some frightful spectre, Take her away! Take her away! But named nobody, and sometimes praised some lady, that Clarissa, I suppose, whom he had invoked when he received his death's wound, calling her Sweet excellence! Divine creature! Fair sufferer! And once he said, Look down, blessed spirit, look down! And there stopped, his lips, however, moving. At 9 in the morning he was seized with convulsions and fainted away, and it was a quarter of an hour before he came out of them. His few last words I must not omit, as they show an ultimate composure, which may administer some consolation to his honourable friends. Blessed, said he, addressing himself no doubt to heaven, for his dying eyes were lifted up. A strong convulsion prevented him for a few moments saying more, but recovering, he again, with great fervour, lifting up his eyes and his spread hands, pronounced the word blessed. Then in a seeming ejaculation he spoke inwardly, so as not to be understood. At last he distinctly pronounced these 3 words, Let this expiate. And then, his head sinking on his pillow, he expired, at about half an hour after 10. He little thought, poor gentleman, his end so near, so had given no direction about his body. I have caused it to be embowelled and deposited in a vault, till I have orders from England. This is a favour that was procured with difficulty, and would have been refused, had he not been an Englishman of rank, a nation with reason respected in every Austrian government, for he had refused ghostly attendance and the sacraments in the Catholic way. May his soul be happy, I pray God. I have had some trouble also, on account of the manner of his death, from the magistracy here, who have taken the requisite informations in the affair, and it has cost some money, of which, and of the dear chevalier's effects, I will give you a faithful account in my next. And so, waiting at this place your commands, I am, Sir, your most faithful and obedient servant, F. J. de la Tour. End of Letter 63. Conclusion, Part 1 of Clarissa Harlowe, or The History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or The History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Conclusion, Part 1. Supposed to be written by Mr. Belford. What remains to be mentioned for the satisfaction of such of the readers as may be presumed to have interested themselves in the fortunes of those other principals in the story who survived Mr. Lovelace, will be found summarily related as follows. The news of Mr. Lovelace's unhappy end was received with as much grief by his own relations as it was with exultation by the Harlowe family and by Miss Howe. His own family were most to be pitied, because, being sincere admirers of the inimitable lady, they were greatly grieved for the injustice done her, and now had the additional mortification of losing the only male of it by a violent death. That his fate was deserved was still a heightening of their calamity, as they had for that very reason, and his unpreparedness for it, but too much ground for apprehension with regard to his future happiness. While the other family, from their unforgiving spirit, and even the noble young lady above mentioned from her lively resentments, found his death some temporary alleviation of the heavy loss they had sustained, principally through his means. Temporary alleviation, we repeat, as to the Harlowe family, for they were far from being happy or easy in their reflections upon their own conduct, and still the less as the inconsolable mother rested not till she had procured, by means of Colonel Morden, large extracts from some of the letters that compose this history, which convince them all that the very correspondence which Clarissa, while with them, renewed with Mr. Lovelace, was renewed for their sakes, more than for her own; that she had given him no encouragement contrary to her duty, and to that prudence for which she was so early noted; that had they trusted to a discretion which they owned she had never brought into question, she would have extricated them and herself, as she once proposed to her mother, from all difficulties as to Lovelace; that she, if any woman ever could, would have given a glorious instance of a passion conquered, or at least kept under by reason and by piety, the man being too immoral to be implicitly beloved. The unhappy parents and uncles, from the perusal of these extracts, too evidently for their peace, saw that it was entirely owing to the avarice, the ambition, the envy of her implacable brother and sister, and to the senseless confederacy entered into by the whole family, to compel her to give her hand to a man she must despise, or she had not been a Clarissa, and to their consequent persecution of her, that she ever thought of quitting her father's house; and that even when she first entertained such a thought, it was with intent, if possible, to procure for herself a private asylum with Mrs. Howe, or at some other place of safety; but not with Mr. Lovelace, nor with any of the ladies of his family, though invited by the latter; from whence she might propose terms which ought to have been complied with, and which were entirely consistent with her duty; that though she found herself disappointed of the hoped for refuge and protection, she intended not, by meeting Mr. Lovelace, to put herself into his power; all that she aimed at by taking that step being to endeavour to pacify so fierce a spirit, lest he should, as he indeed was determined to do, pay a visit to her friends, which might have been attended with fatal consequences, but was spirited away by him in such a manner as made her an object of pity rather than of blame. These extracts further convince them all that it was to her unaffected regret that she found that marriage was not in her power afterwards for a long time, and at last but on one occasion, when their unnatural cruelty to her, on a new application she had made to her aunt Hervey to procure mercy and pardon, rendered her incapable of receiving his proffered hand, and so obliged her to suspend the day, intending only to suspend it till recovered. They saw with equal abhorrence of Lovelace, and of their own cruelty, and with the highest admiration of her, that the majesty of her virtue had awed the most daring spirit in the world, so that he durst not attempt to carry his base designs into execution till, by wicked potions, he had made her senseless the previous sacrifice. But how did they in a manner adore her memory? How did they recriminate upon each other, when they found that she had not only preserved herself from repeated outrage by the most glorious and intrepid behaviour, in defiance and to the utter confusion of all his libertine notions, but had the fortitude, constantly, and with a noble disdain, to reject him? Whom? Why, the man she once could have loved, kneeling for pardon, and begging to be permitted to make her the best reparation then in his power to make her, that is to say, by marriage. His fortunes high and unbroken, she his prisoner at the time in a vile house, rejected by all her friends, upon repeated application to them for mercy and forgiveness, rejected, mercy and forgiveness, and a last blessing, afterwards imploring, and that as much to lighten their future remorses, as for the comfort of her own pious heart; yet though savagely refused, on a supposition that she was not so near her end as she was represented, departed, forgiving and blessing them all. Then they recollected that her posthumous letters, instead of reproaches, were filled with comfortings; that she had in her last will, in their own way, laid obligations upon them all, obligations which they neither deserved nor expected, as if she thought to repair the injustice which self-partiality made some of them conclude done to them by her grandfather in his will. These intelligences and recollections were perpetual subjects of recrimination to them, heightened their anguish for the loss of a child who was the glory of their family, and not seldom made them shun each other, at the times they were accustomed to meet together, that they might avoid the mutual reproaches of eyes that spoke when tongues were silent, their stings also sharpened by time. What an unhappy family was this! Well might Colonel Morden, in the words of Juvenal, challenge all other miserable families to produce such a growing distress as that of the Harlowes, a few months before so happy, was able to produce. Humani generis mores tibi nose volenti, sufficit una domus, paucos consume dies et, dicere te miserum, postquam illinc veneris aude. Mrs. Harlowe lived about 2 years and a half after the lamented death of her Clarissa. Mr. Harlowe had the additional affliction to survive his lady about half a year; her death, by new pointing his former anguish and remorse, hastening his own. Both in their last hours, however, comforted themselves that they should be restored to their blessed daughter, as they always, from the time they were acquainted with the above particulars of her story, and with her happy exit, called her. They both lived, however, to see their son James and their daughter Arabella married, but not to take joy in either of their nuptials. Mr. James Harlowe married a woman of family, an orphan, and is obliged, at a very great expense, to support his claim to estates which were his principal inducement to make his addresses to her, but which, to this day, he has not recovered, nor is likely to recover, having powerful adversaries to contend with, and a title to assert, which admits of litigation, and he not blessed with so much patience as is necessary to persons embarrassed in law. What is further observable with regard to him is, that the match was entirely of his own head, against the advice of his father, mother, and uncles, who warned him of marrying in this lady a lawsuit for life. His ungenerous behaviour to his wife, for what she cannot help, and for what is as much her misfortune as his, has occasioned such estrangements between them, she being a woman of spirit, as, were the lawsuits determined even more favourably than probably they will be, must make him unhappy to the end of his life. He attributes all his misfortunes, when he opens himself to the few friends he has, to his vile and cruel treatment of his angelic sister. He confesses these misfortunes to be just, without having temper to acquiesce in the acknowledged justice. 1 month in every year he puts on mourning, and that month commences with him on the 7th of September, during which he shuts himself up from all company. Finally, he is looked upon, and often calls himself, the most miserable of beings. Arabella's fortune became a temptation to a man of quality to make his addresses to her, his title an inducement with her to approve of him. Brothers and sisters, when they are not friends, are generally the sharpest enemies to each other. He thought too much was done for in the settlements. She thought not enough, and for some years past they have so heartily hated each other, that if either know a joy, it is in being told of some new misfortune or displeasure that happens to the other. Indeed, before they came to an open rupture, they were continually loading each other, by way of exonerating themselves, to the additional disquiet of the whole family, with the principal guilt of their implacable behaviour and sordid cruelty to their admirable sister. May the reports that are spread of this lady's further unhappiness from her lord's free life, a fault she justly thought so odious in Mr. Lovelace, though that would not have been an insuperable objection with her to his addresses, and of his public slights and contempt of her, and even sometimes of his personal abuses, which are said to be owing to her impatient spirit and violent passions, be utterly groundless. For what a heart must that be, which would wish she might be as great a torment to herself as she had aimed to be to her sister? Especially as she regrets to this hour, and declares that she shall to the last of her life, her cruel treatment of that sister, and, as well as her brother, is but too ready to attribute to that her own unhappiness. Mr. Antony and Mr. John Harlowe are still, at the writing of this, living, but often declare that, with their beloved niece, they lost all the joy of their lives, and lament without reserve, in all companies, the unnatural part they were induced to take against her. Mr. Solmes is also still living, if a man of his cast may be said to live, for his general behaviour and sordid manners are such as justify the aversion the excellent lady had to him. He has, moreover, found his addresses rejected by several women of far inferior fortunes, great as his own are, to those of the lady to whom he was encouraged to aspire. Mr. Mowbray and Mr. Tourville, having lost the man in whose conversation they so much delighted, shocked and awakened by the several unhappy catastrophes before their eyes, and having always rather ductile in dictating hearts, took their friend Belford's advice, converted the remainder of their fortunes into annuities for life, and retired, the one into Yorkshire, the other into Nottinghamshire, of which counties they are natives. Their friend Belford managing their concerns for them, and corresponding with them, and having more and more hopes every time he sees them, which is once or twice a year when they come to town, that they will become more and more worthy of their names and families. As those sisters in iniquity, Sally Martin and Polly Horton, had abilities and education superior to what creatures of their caste generally can boast of, and as their histories are nowhere given in the preceding papers, in which they are frequently mentioned, it cannot fail of gratifying the reader's curiosity, as well as answering the good ends designed by the publication of this work, to give a brief account of their parentage and manner of training up, preparative to the vile courses they fell into, and of what became of them after the dreadful exit of the infamous Sinclair. Sally Martin was the daughter of a substantial mercer at the court end of the town, to whom her mother, a grocer's daughter in the city, brought her handsome fortune. And both having a gay turn, and being fond of the fashions which it was their business to promote, and which the wives and daughters of the uppermost tradesmen, especially in that quarter of the town, generally affect to follow, it was no wonder that they brought up their daughter accordingly, nor that she, who was a very sprightly and ready-witted girl, and reckoned very pretty and very genteel, should every year improve upon such examples. She early found herself mistress of herself. All she did was right, all she said was admired. Early, very early, did she dismiss blushes from her cheek. She could not blush, because she could not doubt, and silence, whatever was the subject, was as much a stranger to her as diffidence. She never was left out of any party of pleasure after she had passed her 9th year, and in honour of her prattling vein was considered as a principal person in the frequent treats and entertainments which her parents, fond of luxurious living, gave with a view to increase their acquaintance for the sake of their business, not duly reflecting that the part they suffered her to take in what made for their interest would probably be a mean to quicken their appetites and ruin the morals of their daughter, for whose sake, as an only child, they were solicitous to obtain wealth. The child so much a woman, what must the woman be? At 15 or 16 she affected, both in dress and manners, to ape such of the quality as were most apish. The richest silks in her father's shop were not too rich for her. At all public diversions she was the leader, instead of the led, of all her female kindred and acquaintances, though they were a third older than herself. She would bustle herself into a place, and make room for her more bashful companions, through the frowns of the first possessors at a crowded theatre, leaving every one near her amazed at her self-consequence, wondering she had no servant to keep place for her, whisperingly inquiring who she was, and then sitting down, admiring her fortitude. She officiously made herself of consequence to the most noted players, who, as one of their patronesses, applied to her for her interest on their benefit nights. She knew the Christian as well as surname of every pretty fellow who frequented public places, and affected to speak of them by the former. Those who had not obeyed the call her eyes always made upon all of them for notice at her entrance, or before she took her seat, were spoken of with haughtiness as Jacks or Toms, while her favourites, with an affectedly endearing familiarity and a prettiness of accent, were Jackies and Tommies, and if they stood very high in her graces, dear devils and agreeable toads. She sat in judgment, and an inexorable judge she was, upon the actions and conduct of every man and woman of quality and fashion, as they became the subjects of conversation. She was deeply learned in the scandalous chronicle. She made every character, every praise, and every censure serve to exalt herself. She should scorn to do so or so, or that was ever her way, and just what she did or liked to do, and judging herself by the vileness of the most vile of her sex, she wiped her mouth, and sat down satisfied with her own virtue. She had her chair to attend her wherever she went, and found people among her betters, as her pride stooped to call some of the most insignificant people in the world, to encourage her visits. She was practised in all the arts of the card table, a true Spartan girl, and had even courage, occasionally, to wrangle off a detection. Late hours, turning night into day, and day into night, were the almost unavoidable consequences of her frequent play. Her parents pleased themselves that their Sally had a charming constitution, and as long as she suffered not in her health, they were regardless of her morals. The needle she hated, and made the constant subjects of her ridicule the fine works that used to employ and keep out of idleness, luxury, and extravagance, and at home, were they to have been of no other service, the women of the last age, when there were no Vauxhalls, Raneleys, Marbones, and such like places of diversion, to dress out for and gad after. And as to family management, her parents had not required any knowledge of that sort from her, and she considered it as a qualification only necessary for hirelings and the low-born, and as utterly unworthy of the attention of a modern fine lady. Although her father had great business, yet, living in so high and expensive a way, he pretended not to give her a fortune answerable to it. Neither he nor his wife having set out with any notion of frugality, could think of retrenching. Nor did their daughter desire that they should retrench. They thought glare or ostentation reputable. They called it living genteelly. And as they lifted their heads above their neighbours, they supposed their credit concerned to go forward, rather than backward, in outward appearances. They flattered themselves, and they flattered their girl, and she was entirely of their opinion, that she had charms and wit enough to attract some man of rank, or fortune at least. And yet this daughter of a mercer father and grocer mother could not bear the thoughts of a creeping cit, encouraging herself with a few instances, common ones, of girls much inferior to herself in station, talents, education, and even fortune, who had succeeded, as she doubted not to succeed. Handsome settlements, and a chariot, that tempting gewgaw to the vanity of the middling class of females, were the least that she proposed to herself. But all this while neither her parents nor herself considered that she had appetites indulged to struggle with, and a turn of education given her, as well as a warm constitution, unguarded by sound principles, and unbenefited by example, which made her much better qualified for a mistress than a wife. Her 20th year, to her own equal wonder and regret, passed over her head, and she had not one offer that her pride would permit her to accept of. A girl from 15 to 18, her beauty then beginning to blossom, will, as a new thing, attract the eyes of men. But if she make her face cheap at public places, she will find that new faces will draw more attention than fine faces constantly seen. Policy, therefore, if nothing else were considered, would induce a young beauty, if she could tame her vanity, just to show herself and to be talked of, and then withdrawing, as if from discretion, and discreet it will be to do so, expect to be sought after, rather than to be thought to seek for, only reviving now and then the memory of herself, at the public places in turn, if she find herself likely to be forgotten, and then she will be new again. But this observation ought young ladies always to have in their heads, that they can hardly ever expect to gratify their vanity, and at the same time gain the admiration of men worthy of making partners for life. They may, in short, have many admirers at public places, but not one lover. Sally Martin knew nothing of this doctrine. Her beauty was in its bloom, and yet she found herself neglected. Sally Martin, the mercer's daughter. She never fails being here, was the answer, and the accompanying observation made to every questioner, Who is that lady? At last her destiny approached. It was at a masquerade that she first saw the gay, the handsome Lovelace, who was just returned from his travels. She was immediately struck with his figure, and with the brilliant things that she heard fall from his lips as he happened to sit near her. He, who was not then looking out for a wife, was taken with Sally's smartness, and with an air that at the same time showed her to be equally genteel and self-significant, and signs of approbation mutually passing, he found no difficulty in acquainting himself where to visit her next day. And yet it was some mortification to a person of her self-consequence and gay appearance to submit to be known by so fine a young gentleman as no more than a mercer's daughter. So natural is it for a girl brought up as Sally was, to be occasionally ashamed of those whose folly had set her above herself. But whatever it might be to Sally, it was no disappointment to Mr. Lovelace to find his mistress of no higher degree, because he hoped to reduce her soon to the lowest condition that an unhappy woman can fall into. But when Miss Martin had informed herself that her lover was the nephew and presumptive heir of Lord M., she thought him the very man for whom she had been so long and so impatiently looking out, and for whom it was worth her while to spread her toils. And here it may not be amiss to observe, that it is very probable that Mr. Lovelace had Sally Martin in his thoughts, and perhaps 2 or 3 more, whose hopes of marriage from him had led them to their ruin, when he drew the following whimsical picture, in a letter to his friend Belford, not inserted in the preceding collection. Methinks, says he, I see a young couple in courtship, having each a design upon the other. The girl plays off. She is very happy as she is. She cannot be happier. She will not change her single state. The man, I will suppose, is one who does not confess that he desires not that she should. She holds ready a net under her apron, he another under his coat, each intending to throw it over the other's neck, she over his, when her pride is gratified, and she thinks she can be sure of him, he over hers, when the watch for a yielding moment has carried consent too far. And suppose he happens to be the more dexterous of the two, and whips his net over her, before she can cast hers over him, how, I would fain know, can she be justly entitled to cry out upon cruelty, barbarity, deception, sacrifices, and all the rest of the exclamatory nonsense with which the pretty fools in such a case are wont to din the ears of their conquerors? Is it not just, thinkest thou, when she makes her appeal to gods and men, that both gods and men should laugh at her, and hitting her in the teeth with her own felonious intentions, bid her sit down patiently under her deserved disappointment? In short, Sally's parents, as well as herself, encouraged Mr. Lovelace's visits. They thought they might trust to a discretion in her which she herself was too wise to doubt. Pride they knew she had, and that, in these cases, is often called discretion. Lord help the sex, says Lovelace, if they had not pride. Nor did they suspect danger from that specious air of sincerity and gentleness of manners, which he could assume or lay aside whenever he pleased. The second masquerade, which was no more than their 3rd meeting abroad, completed her ruin from so practised, though so young, a deceiver, and that before she well knew she was in danger. For having prevailed on her to go off with him about 12 o'clock to his aunt Forbes's, a lady of honour and fortune, to whom he had given reason to expect her future niece, the only hint of marriage he ever gave her, he carried her off to the house of the wicked woman who bears the name of Sinclair in these papers, and there, by promises which she understood in the favourable sense, for where woman loves she seldom doubts enough for her safety, obtained an easy conquest over a virtue that was little more than nominal. He found it not difficult to induce her to proceed in the guilty commerce, till the effects of it became too apparent to be hid. Her parents then, in the first fury of their disappointment, and vexation for being deprived of all hopes of such a son-in-law, turned her out of doors. Her disgrace thus published, she became hardened, and protected by her seducer, whose favourite mistress she then was. She was so incensed against her parents, for an indignity so little suiting with her pride, and the head they had always given her, that she refused to return to them, when, repenting of their passionate treatment of her, they would have been reconciled to her. And becoming the favourite daughter of her mother Sinclair, at the persuasions of that abandoned woman she practised to bring on an abortion, which she effected, though she was so far gone that it had like to have cost her her life. Thus, unchastity her first crime, murder her next, her conscience became seared, and young as she was, and fond of her deceiver, soon grew indelicate enough, having so thorough-paced a schoolmistress, to do all she could to promote the pleasures of the man who had ruined her, scrupling not, with a spirit truly diabolical, to endeavour to draw in others to follow her example. And it is hardly to be believed what mischiefs of this sort she was the means of effecting, woman confiding in, and daring woman, and she a creature of specious appearance, and great art. A still viler wickedness, if possible, remains to be said of Sally Martin. Her father dying, her mother, in hopes to reclaim her, as she called it, proposed her to quit the house of the infamous Sinclair, and to retire with her into the country, where her disgrace and her then wicked way of life would not be known, and there so to live as to save appearances, the only virtue she had ever taught her, besides that of endeavouring rather to delude than be deluded. To this Sally consented, but with no other intention, as she often owned, and gloried in it, than to cheat her mother of the greatest part of her substance, in revenge for consenting to her being turned out of doors long before, and by way of reprisal for having persuaded her father, as she would have it, to cut her off, in his last will, from any share in his fortune. This unnatural wickedness in half a year's time she brought about, and then the serpent retired to her obscene den with her spoils, laughing at what she had done, even after it had broken her mother's heart, as it did in a few months' time, a severe but just punishment for the unprincipled education she had given her. It ought to be added, that this was an iniquity of which neither Mr. Lovelace nor any of his friends could bear to hear her boast, and always checked her for it whenever she did, condemning it with one voice. And it is certain that this, and other instances of her complicated wickedness, turned early Lovelace's heart against her; and had she not been subservient to him in his other pursuits, he would not have endured her: for, speaking of her, he would say, "Let not any one reproach us, Jack. There is no wickedness like the wickedness of a woman." A bad education was the preparative, it must be confessed; and for this Sally Martin had reason to thank her parents, as they had reason to thank themselves for what followed. But had she not met with a Lovelace, she had avoided a Sinclair, and might have gone on at the common rate of wives so educated, and been the mother of children turned out to take their chance in the world, as she was, so many lumps of soft wax, fit to take any impression that the first accidents gave them, neither happy nor making happy, every thing but useful and well off, if not extremely miserable. Polly Horton was the daughter of a gentlewoman, well descended, whose husband, a man of family and of honour, was a captain in the Guards. He died when Polly was about 9 years of age, leaving her to the care of her mother, a lively young lady of about 26, with a genteel provision for both. Her mother was extremely fond of her Polly, but had it not in herself to manifest the true, the genuine fondness of a parent, by a strict and guarded education, dressing out and visiting and being visited by the gay of her own sex, and casting her eye abroad, as one very ready to try her fortune again in the married state. This induced those airs, and a love to those diversions, which make a young widow of so lively a turn the unfittest tutoress in the world, even to her own daughter. Mrs. Horton herself, having had an early turn to music, and that sort of reading which is but an earlier debauchery for young minds, preparative to the grosser at riper years, to wit, romances and novels, songs and plays, and those without distinction, moral or immoral, she indulged her daughter in the same taste; and at those hours, when they could not take part in the more active and lively amusements and kill-times, as some call them, used to employ Miss to read to her, happy enough in her own imagination, that while she was diverting her own ears, and sometimes, as the piece was, corrupting her own heart and her child's too, she was teaching Miss to read and improve her mind. For it was the boast of every tea-table half-hour, that Miss Horton, in propriety, accent, and emphasis, surpassed all the young ladies her age; and at other times, complimenting the pleased mother, "Bless me, madam, with what a surprising grace Miss Horton reads! She enters into the very spirit of her subject. This she could have from nobody but you." An intended praise, but, as the subjects were, would have been a severe satire in the mouth of an enemy; while the fond, the inconsiderate mother, with a delighted air, would cry, "Why, I cannot but say, Miss Horton does credit to her tutoress;" and then a "Come hither, my best love," and with a kiss of approbation, "What a pleasure to your dear papa! Had he lived to see your improvements, my charmer," concluding with a sigh of satisfaction, her eyes turning round upon the circle, to take in all the silent applauses of theirs. But little thought the fond, the foolish mother, what the plant would be which was springing up from these seeds. Little imagined she that her own ruin, as well as her child's, was to be the consequence of this fine education; and that, in the same ill-fated hour, the honour of both mother and daughter was to become a sacrifice to the intriguing invader. This, the laughing girl, when abandoned to her evil destiny, and in company with her sister Sally and others, each recounting their settings out, their progress, and their fall, frequently related to be her education and manner of training up. This, and to see a succession of humble servants buzzing about a mother, who took too much pride in her dresses of that kind, what a beginning, what an example, to a constitution of tinder so prepared to receive the spark struck from the steely forehead and flinty heart of such a libertine as at last it was their fortune to be encountered by! In short, as Miss grew up under the influences of such a directress, and of books so light and frothy, with the inflaming additions of music, concerts, operas, plays, assemblies, balls, and the rest of the rabble of amusements of modern life, it is no wonder that, like early fruit, she was soon ripened to the hand of the insidious gatherer. At 15, she owned she was ready to fancy herself the heroine of every novel and of every comedy she read, so well did she enter into the spirit of her subject. She glowed to become the object of some hero's flame, and perfectly longed to begin an intrigue, and even to be run away with by some enterprising lover, yet had neither confinement nor check to apprehend from her indiscreet mother, which she thought absolutely necessary, to constitute a Parthenissa. Nevertheless, with all these fine modern qualities, did she complete her 19th year, before she met with any address of consequence, one half of her admirers being afraid, because of her gay turn and but middling fortune, to make serious applications for her favour, while others were kept at a distance by the superior airs she assumed, and a third sort, not sufficiently penetrating the foibles either of mother or daughter, were kept off by the supposed watchful care of the former. But when the man of intrepidity and intrigue was found, never was heroine so soon subdued, never goddess so easily stripped of her celestials. For at the opera, a diversion at which neither she nor her mother ever missed to be present, she beheld the specious Lovelace, beheld him invested with all the airs of heroic insult, resenting a slight affront offered to his Sally Martin by two gentlemen who had known her in her more hopeful state, one of whom Mr. Lovelace obliged to sneak away with a broken head, given with the pommel of his sword, the other with a bloody nose, neither of them well supporting that readiness of offence which, it seems, was a part of their known character to be guilty of. The gallantry of this action drawing every bystander on the side of the hero, "Oh, the brave man!" cried Polly Horton aloud to her mother, in a kind of rapture. "How needful the protection of the brave to the fair!" with a softness in her voice which she had taught herself to suit her fancied high condition of life. A speech so much in his favour could not but take the notice of a man, who was but too sensible of the advantages which his fine person and noble air gave him over the gentler hearts, who was always watching every female eye, and who had his ear continually turned to every affected voice, for that was one of his indications of a proper subject to be attempted. Affectation of every sort, he used to say, is a certain sign of a wrong-turned head, of a faulty judgment, and upon such a basis I seldom build in vain. He instantly resolved to be acquainted with a young creature who seemed so strongly prejudiced in his favour. Never man had a ready invention for all sorts of mischief. He gave his Sally her cue. He called her sister in their hearing; and Sally, whisperingly, gave the young lady and her mother, in her own way, the particulars of the affront she had received, making herself an angel of light, to cast a brighter ray upon the character of her heroic brother. She particularly praised his known and approved courage, and mingled with her praises of him such circumstances relating to his birth, his fortune, and endowments, as left him nothing to do but to fall in love with the enamoured Polly. Mr. Lovelace presently saw what turn to give his professions. So brave a man, yet of manners so gentle, hit the young lady's taste, nor could she suspect the heart that such an aspect covered. This was the man, the very man, she whispered to her mother. And when the opera was over, his servant procuring a coach, he undertook, with his specious sister, to set them down at their own lodgings, though situated a quite different way from his, and there were they prevailed upon to alight, and partake of a slight repast. Sally pressed them to return the favour to her at her aunt Forbes's, and hoped it would be before her brother went to his own seat. They promised her, and named their evening. A splendid entertainment was provided. The guest came, having in the interim found all that was said of his name and family and fortune to be true. Persons of so little strictness in their own morals took it not into their heads to be very inquisitive after his. Music and dancing had their share in the entertainment. These opened their hearts, already half opened by love. The aunt Forbes and the lover's sister kept them open by their own example. The hero sung, vowed, promised. Their gratitude was moved, their delights were augmented, their hopes increased, their confidence was engaged, all their appetites up in arms, the rich wines co-operating, beat quite off their guard, and not thought enough remaining for so much as suspicion, Miss, detached from her mother by Sally, soon fell a sacrifice to the successful intriguer. The widow herself, half intoxicated, and raised as she was with artful mixtures, and inflamed by love, unexpectedly tended by one of the libertines, his constant companions, to whom an opportunity was contrived to be given to be alone with her, and that closely followed by importunity, fell into her daughter's error, the consequences of which, in length of time, becoming apparent, grief, shame, remorse, seized her heart, her own indiscretion not allowing her to arraign her daughters, and she survived not her delivery, leaving Polly with child likewise, who, when delivered, being too fond of the gay deluder to renounce his company, even when she found herself deluded, fell into a course of extravagance and dissoluteness, ran through her fortune in a very little time, and as an high preferment at last with Sally, was admitted a quarter partner with the detestable Sinclair. All that is necessary to add to the history of these unhappy women will be comprised in a very little compass. After the death of the profligate Sinclair, they kept on the infamous trade with too much success, till an accident happened in the house, a gentleman of family killed in it in a fray, contending with another for a new vamped face. Sally was accused of holding the gentleman's arm, while his more favoured adversary ran him through the heart and then made off, and she, being tried for her life, narrowly escaped. This accident obliged them to break up housekeeping, and not having been frugal enough of their ill-gotten gains, lavishing upon one what they got by another, They were compelled for subsistence sake to enter themselves as under managers at such another house as their own had been, in which service soon after Sally died of a fever and surfeit got by a debauch, and the other about a month after by a violent cold, occasioned through carelessness in a salivation. Happier scenes opened for the remaining characters, for it might be descending too low to mention the untimely ends of Dorcas and of William, Mr. Lovelace's wicked servant, and the pining and consumptive ones of Betty Barnes and Joseph Leman, unmarried both, and in less than a year after the happy death of their excellent young lady. The good Mrs. Norton passed the small remainder of her life as happily as she wished in her beloved foster daughter's dairy house, as it used to be called. As she wished, we repeat, for she had too strong aspirations after another life to be greatly attached to this. She laid out the greatest part of her time in doing good by her advice, and by the prudent management of the fund committed to her direction. Having lived an exemplary life from her youth upwards, and seen her son happily settled in the world, she departed with ease and calmness, without pang or agony, like a tired traveller falling into a sweet slumber, her last words expressing her hope of being restored to the child of her bosom, and to her own excellent father and mother, to whose care and pains she owed that good education to which she was indebted for all her other blessings. The Poor's Fund, which was committed to her care, she resigned a week before her death into the hands of Mrs. Hickman, according the direction of the will, and all the accounts and disbursements with it, which she had kept with such an exactness, that the lady declares that she will follow her method, and only wishes to discharge the trust as well. Miss Howe was not to be persuaded to quit her mourning for her dear friend until 6 months were fully expired, and then she made Mr. Hickman one of the happiest men in the world. A woman of her fine sense and understanding, married to a man of virtue and good nature, who had no past capital errors to reflect upon, and to abate his joys, and whose behaviour to Mrs. Hickman is as affectionate as it was respectful to Miss Howe, could not do otherwise. They are already blessed with 2 fine children, a daughter to whom by joint consent they have given the name of her beloved friend, and a son who bears that of his father. She has allotted to Mr. Hickman, who takes delight in doing good, and that as much for its own sake as to oblige her, his part of the management of the Poor's Fund, to be accountable for it, as she pleasantly says, to her. She has appropriated every Thursday morning for her part of that management, and takes so much delight in the task, that she declares it to be one of the most agreeable of her amusements, and the more agreeable, as she teaches every one whom she benefits to bless the memory of her departed friend, to whom she attributes the merit of all her own charities, as well as the honour of those which she dispenses in pursuance of her will. She has declared that this fund shall never fail while she lives. She has even engaged her mother to contribute annually to it, and Mr. Hickman has appropriated 20 a year to the same, in consideration of which she allows him to recommend 4 objects yearly to partake of it. Allows is her style, for she assumes the whole prerogative of dispensing this charity, the only prerogative she does or has occasion to assume. In every other case there is but one will between them, and that is generally his or hers, as either speaks first, upon any subject, be it what it will. Mrs. Hickman, she sometimes as pleasantly as generously tells him, must not quite forget that she was once Miss Howe, because if he had not loved her as such, and with all her foibles, she had never been Mrs. Hickman. Nevertheless, she seriously on all occasions, and that to others as well as to himself, confesses that she owes him unreturnable obligations for his patience with her in her day, and for his generous behaviour to her in his. And still more the highly does she esteem and love him, as she reflects upon his past kindness to her beloved friend, and on that dear friend's good opinion of him. Nor is it less grateful to her that the worthy man joins most sincerely with her in all those respectful and affectionate recollections which make the memory of the departed precious to survivors. Mr. Belford was not so destitute of humanity and affection as to be unconcerned at the unhappy fate of his most intimate friend. But when he reflects upon the untimely ends of several of his companions, but just mentioned in the preceding history, on the shocking despondency and death of his poor friend Belton, on the signal justice which overtook the wicked Tomlinson, on the dreadful exit of the infamous Sinclair, on the deep remorses of his more valued friend, and on the other hand, on the example set him by the most excellent of her sex, and on her blessed preparation and happy departure, and when he considers, as he often does with awe and terror, that his wicked habits were so rooted in his depraved heart, that all these warnings and this lovely example seem to be but necessary to enable him to subdue them and to reform, and that such awakening calls are hardly ever afforded to men of his cast, or if they are, but seldom attended the full vigour of constitution. When he reflects upon all these things, he adores the mercy which through these calls has snatched him as a brand out of the fire, and thinks himself obliged to make it his endeavours to find out and to reform any of those who may have been endangered by his means, as well as to repair to the utmost of his power any damage or mischiefs which he may have occasioned to others. With regard to the trust with which he was honoured by the inimitable lady, he had the pleasure of acquitting himself of it in a very few months, to every body's satisfaction, even to that of the unhappy family, who sent him their thanks on the occasion. Nor was he, at delivering up his accounts, contented without resigning the legacy bequeathed to him to the uses of the will; so that the Poor's Fund, as it is called, is become a very considerable sum, and will be a lasting bank for relief of objects who best deserve relief. There was but one earthly blessing which remained for Mr. Belford to wish for, in order, morally speaking, to secure to him all his other blessings; and that was, the greatest of all worldly ones, a virtuous and prudent wife. So free a liver as he had been, he did not think that he could be worthy of such a one, till upon an impartial examination of himself he found the pleasure he had in his new resolutions so great, and his abhorrence of his former courses so sincere, that he was the less apprehensive of a deviation. Upon this presumption, having also kept in his mind some encouraging hints from Mr. Lovelace, and having been so happy as to have it in his power to oblige Lord M. and that whole noble family, by some services grateful to them, the request for which from his unhappy friend was brought over, among other papers, with the dead body, by de la Tour, he besought that nobleman's leave to make his addresses to Miss Charlotte Montague, the eldest of his lordship's two nieces; and making at the same time such proposals of settlements as were not objected to, his lordship was pleased to use his powerful interest in his favour; and his worthy niece having no engagement, she had the goodness to honour Mr. Belford with her hand, and thereby made him as completely happy as a man can be, who has enormities to reflect upon, which are out of his power to atone for, by reason of the death of some of the injured parties, and the irreclaimableness of others. Happy is the man, who, in the time of health and strength, sees and reforms the error of his ways. But how much more happy is he who has no capital and wilful errors to repent of! How unmixed and sincere must the joys of such a one come to him! Lord M. added bountifully in his lifetime, as did also the two ladies his sisters, to the fortune of their worthy niece; and as Mr. Belford had been blessed with a son by her, his lordship at his death, which happened just 3 years after the untimely one of his unhappy nephew, was pleased to devise to that son and to his descendants for ever, and in case of his death unmarried, to any other children of his niece, his Hertfordshire estate, designed for Mr. Lovelace, which he made up to the value of a moiety of his real estates, bequeathing also a moiety of his personal to the same lady. Miss Patty Montague, a fine young lady, to whom her noble uncle at his death devised the other moiety of his real and personal estates, including his seat in Berkshire, lives at present with her excellent sister, Mrs. Belford, to whom she removed upon Lord M.'s death; but in all probability will soon be the lady of a worthy baronet, of ancient family, fine qualities, and ample fortunes, just returned from his travels, with a character superior to the very good one he set out with, a case that very seldom happens, although the end of travel is improvement. Colonel Morden, who with so many virtues and accomplishments cannot be unhappy, in several letters to the executor, with whom he corresponds from Florence, having since his unhappy affair with Mr. Lovelace changed his purpose of coming so soon to reside in England as he had intended, declares, that although he thought himself obliged either to accept of what he took to be a challenge, as such, or tamely to acknowledge that he gave up all resentment of his cousin's wrongs, and in a manner to beg pardon for having spoken freely of Mr. Lovelace behind his back; and although at the time he owns he was not sorry to be called upon, as he was, to take either the one course or the other, yet now, coolly reflecting upon his beloved cousin's reasonings against duelling, and upon the price it had too probably cost the unhappy man, he wishes he had more fully considered those words in his cousin's posthumous letter: "If God will allow him time for repentance, why should you deny it him?" Several worthy persons have wished that the heinous practice of duelling had been more forcibly discouraged, by way of note, at the conclusion of a work designed to recommend the highest and most important doctrines of Christianity. It is humbly presumed that these persons have not sufficiently attended to what is already done on that subject in Vol. 2, Letter 12, and in this volume, Letter 16, 43, 44, and 45. To conclude, the worthy widow Lovick continues to live with Mr. Belford, and by her prudent behaviour, piety, and usefulness, has endeared herself to her lady and to the whole family. End of conclusion, Part 1.
Conclusion, Part 2 of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Conclusion, Part 2. Postscript referred to in the preface, in which several objections that have been made, as well to the catastrophe as to different parts of the preceding history, are briefly considered. The foregoing work having been published at 3 different periods of time, the author, in the course of its publication, was favoured with many anonymous letters,
in which the writers differently express their wishes with regard to the apprehended catastrophe. Most of those directed to him by the gentler sex turned in favour of what they called a fortunate ending. Some of the fair writers, enamoured, as they declared, with the character of the heroine, were warmly solicitous to have her made happy; and others, likewise of their mind, insisted that poetical justice required that it should be so. And when, says one ingenious lady, whose undoubted motive was good nature and humanity, it must be concluded that it is in an author's power to make his piece end as he pleases, why should he not give pleasure rather than pain to the reader whom he has interested in favour of his principal characters? Others, and some gentlemen, declared against tragedies in general, and in favour of comedies, almost in the words of Lovelace, who was supported in his taste by all the women at Mrs. Sinclair's, and by Sinclair herself. I have too much feeling, said he. There is enough in the world to make our hearts sad, without carrying grief into our diversions, and making the distresses of others our own. And how was this happy ending to be brought about? Why, by this very easy and trite expedient, to wit, by reforming Lovelace, and marrying him to Clarissa; not, however, abating her one of her trials, nor any of her sufferings, for the sake of the sport her distresses would give to the tender-hearted reader as she went along, the last outrage excepted, that, indeed partly in compliment to Lovelace himself, and partly for her delicacy's sake, they were willing to spare her. But whatever were the fate of his work, the author was resolved to take a different method. He always thought that sudden conversions, such, especially, as were left to the candour of the reader to suppose and make out, has neither art, nor nature, nor even probability in them, and that they were, moreover, of a very bad example. To have a Lovelace, for a series of years, glory in his wickedness, and think that he had nothing to do, but as an act of grace and favour, to hold out his hand, to receive that of the best of women, whenever he pleased, and to have it thought that marriage would be a sufficient amends for all his enormities to others as well as to her, he could not bear that. Nor is reformation, as he has shown in another piece, to be secured by a fine face, by a passion that has sense for its object, nor by the goodness of a wife's heart, nor even example, if the heart of the husband be not graciously touched by the divine finger. It will be seen by this time that the author had a great end in view. He had lived to see the scepticism and infidelity openly avowed, and even endeavoured to be propagated from the press; the greatest doctrines of the gospel brought into question; those of self-denial and mortification blotted out of the catalogue of Christian virtues; and a taste even to wantonness for out-door pleasure and luxury, to the general exclusion of domestic as well as public virtue, industriously promoted among all ranks and degrees of people. In this general depravity, when even the pulpit has lost great part of its weight, and the clergy are considered as a body of interested men, the author thought he should be able to answer it to his own heart, be the success what it would, if he threw in his mite towards introducing a reformation so much wanted; and he imagined that, if in an age given up to diversion and entertainment, if he could steal in, as may be said, and investigate the great doctrines of Christianity under the fashionable guise of an amusement, he should be most likely to serve his purpose, remembering that of the poet: a verse may find him who a sermon flies, and turn delight into a sacrifice. He was resolved, therefore, to attempt something that never yet had been done. He considered that the tragic poets have as seldom made their heroes true objects of pity, as the comics theirs laudable ones of imitation, and still more rarely have made them in their deaths look forward to a future hope. And thus when they die they seem totally to perish. Death in such instances must appear terrible. It must be considered as the greatest evil. But why is death set in such shocking lights, when it is the universal lot? He has indeed thought fit to paint the death of the wicked as terrible as he could paint it. But he has endeavoured to draw that of the good in such an amiable manner, that the very Balaams of the world should not forbear to wish that their latter end might be like that of the heroine. And after all, what is the poetical justice so much contended for by some, as the generality of writers have managed it, but another sort of dispensation than that with which God by revelation teaches us he has thought fit to exercise mankind, whom placing here only in a state of probation, he hath so intermingled good and evil, as to necessitate us to look forward for a more equal dispensation of both. The author of the history, or rather dramatic narrative, of Clarissa is therefore well justified by the Christian system, in deferring to extricate suffering virtue to the time in which it will meet with the completion of its reward; but not absolutely to shelter the conduct observed in it under the sanction of religion, an authority perhaps not of the greatest weight with some of our modern critics. It must be observed that the author is justified in its catastrophe by the greatest master of reason and best judge of composition that ever lived. The learned reader knows we must mean Aristotle, whose sentiments in this matter we shall beg leave to deliver in the words of a very amiable writer of our own country. The English writers of tragedy, says Mr. Addison, are possessed with a notion that when they represent a virtuous or innocent person in distress, they ought not to leave him till they have delivered him out of his troubles, or made him triumph over his enemies. This error they have been led into by a ridiculous doctrine in modern criticism, that they are obliged to an equal distribution of rewards and punishments, and an impartial execution of poetical justice. Who were the first that established this rule, I know not; but I am sure it has no foundation in nature, in reason, or in the practice of the ancients. We find that good and evil happen alike unto all men on this side the grave; and as the principal design of tragedy is to raise commiseration and terror in the minds of the audience, we shall defeat this great end, if we always make virtue and innocence happy and successful. Whatever crosses and disappoints a good man suffers in the body of the tragedy, they will make but small impression on our minds, when we know that in the last act he is to arrive at the end of his wishes and desires. When we see him engaged in the depth of his afflictions, we are apt to comfort ourselves, because we are sure he will find his way out of them, and that his grief, however great soever it may be at present, will soon terminate in gladness. For this reason, the ancient writers of tragedy treated men in their plays, as they are dealt with in the world, by making virtue sometimes happy and sometimes miserable, as they found it in the fable which they made choice of, or as it might affect their audience in the most agreeable manner. Aristotle considers the tragedies that were written in either of those kinds, and observes, that those which ended unhappily had always pleased the people, and carried away the prize, in the public disputes of the state, from those that ended happily. Terror and commiseration leave a pleasing anguish in the mind, and fix the audience in such a serious composure of thought, as is much more lasting and delightful than any little transient starts of joy and satisfaction. Accordingly we find that more of our English tragedies have succeeded, in which the favourites of the audience sink under their calamities, than those in which they recover themselves out of them. The best plays of this kind are The Orphan, Venice Preserved, Alexander the Great, Theodosius, All for Love, Oedipus, Oronoku, Othello, etc. King Lear is an admirable tragedy of the same kind, as Shakespeare wrote it, but as it is reformed, according to the chimerical notion of poetical justice, in my humble opinion it has lost half its beauty. At the same time I must allow, that there are very noble tragedies which have been framed upon the other plan, and have ended happily, as indeed most of the good tragedies which have been written since the starting of the above-mentioned criticism have taken this turn. The Mourning Bride, Tamerlane, Ulysses, Phaedra and Hippolytus, with most of Mr. Dryden's. I must also allow that many of Shakespeare's, and several of the celebrated tragedies of antiquity, are cast in the same form. I do not therefore dispute against this way of writing tragedies, but against the criticism that would establish this as the only method, and by that means would very much cramp the English tragedy, and perhaps give a wrong bent to the genius of our writers. This subject is further considered in a letter to the Spectator. I find your opinion, says the author of it, concerning the late invented term called poetical justice, is controverted by some eminent critics. I have drawn up some additional arguments to strengthen the opinion which you have there delivered, having endeavoured to go to the bottom of that matter. The most perfect man has vices enough to draw down punishments upon his head, and to justify providence in regard to any miseries that may befall him. For this reason I cannot but think that the instruction and moral are much finer, where a man who is virtuous in the main of his character falls into distress, and sinks under the blows of fortune, at the end of a tragedy, than when he is represented as happy and triumphant. Such an example corrects the insolence of human nature, softens the mind of the beholder with sentiments of pity and compassion, comforts him under his own private affliction, and teaches him not to judge of men's virtues by their successes. I cannot think of one real hero in all antiquity so far raised above human infirmities, that he might not be very naturally represented in a tragedy as plunged in misfortunes and calamities. The poet may still find out some prevailing passion or indiscretion in his character, and show it in such a manner as will sufficiently acquit Providence of any injustice in his sufferings. For, as Horace observes, the best man is faulty, though not in so great a degree as those whom we generally call vicious men. If such a strict poetical justice, proceeds the letter-writer, as some gentlemen insist upon, were to be observed in this art, there is no manner of reason why it should not be so little observed in Homer, that his Achilles is placed in the greatest point of glory and success, though his character is morally vicious and only poetically good, if I may use the phrase of our modern critics. The Aeneid is filled with innocent unhappy persons. Nisus and Euryalus, Lausus and Pallas, come all to unfortunate ends. The poet takes notice in particular that in the sacking of Troy, Riphaeus fell, who was the most just character among the Trojans. Cedit et Riphaeus, justissimus unus, qui fuit in Teucris, et servantissimus aequi, dies aliter visum est. The gods thought fit, so blameless Riphaeus fell, who loved fair justice, and observed it well. And that Pantheus could neither be preserved by his transcendent piety, nor by the holy fillets of Apollo, whose priest he was. Nec te tua plurima Panteu, labentum pietas,
nec Apollonis infula texit. Nor could thy piety thee, Pantheus, save, nor e'en thy priesthood from an early grave. I might here mention the practice of ancient tragic poets, both Greek and Latin. But as this particular is touched upon in the paper above mentioned, I shall pass it over in silence. I could produce passages out of Aristotle in favour of my opinion, and if in one place he says, that an absolutely virtuous man should not be represented as unhappy, this does not justify any one who should think fit to bring in an absolutely virtuous man upon the stage. Those who are acquainted with that author's way of writing know very well, that to take the whole extent of his subject into his divisions of it, he often makes use of such cases as are imaginary, and not reducible to practice. I shall conclude, says this gentleman, with observing, that though the Spectator above mentioned is so far against the rule of poetical justice as to affirm, that good men may meet with an unhappy catastrophe in tragedy, it does not say, that ill men may go off unpunished. The reason for this distinction is very plain, namely, because the best of men, as is said above, have faults enough to justify Providence for any misfortunes and afflictions which may befall them. But there are many men so criminal, that they can have no claim or pretence to happiness. The best of men may deserve punishment, but the worst of men cannot deserve happiness. Mr. Addison, as we have seen above, tells us that Aristotle, in considering the tragedies that were written in either of the kinds, observes, that those which ended unhappily had always pleased the people, and carried away the prize, in the public disputes of the stage, from those that ended happily. And we shall take leave to add, that this preference was given at a time when the entertainments of the stage were committed to the care of the magistrates, when the prizes contended for were given by the state, when, of consequence, the emulation among writers was ardent, and when learning was at the highest pitch of glory in that renowned commonwealth. It cannot be supposed that the Athenians, in this their highest age of taste and politeness, were less humane, less tender-hearted, than we of the present. But they were not afraid of being moved, nor ashamed of showing themselves to be so, at the distresses they saw well painted and represented. In short, they were of the opinion, with the wisest of men, that it was better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of mirth, and had fortitude enough to trust themselves with their own generous grief, because they found their hearts mended by it. Thus also Horace, and the politest Romans in the Augustan age, wished to be affected. Ac ne forte putes me, quae facere ipse recusam, cum recte tractant alii, laudere maligne, ille per extentum funem mihi posse videtur, ire poeta, meum qui pectus in anita angit, irritat, mulcet, falsis terroribus implet, ut majus et modo me thebis, modo poent Athenis. Thus Englished by Mr. Pope. Yet, lest thou think I rally more than teach, or praise malignly arts I cannot reach, let me for once presume to instruct the times, to know the poet from the man of rhymes. 'Tis he who gives my breast 1,000 pains, can make me feel each passion that he feigns, and rage compose with more than magic art, with pity and with terror tear my heart, and snatch me o'er the earth or through the air, to Thebes, to Athens, when he will, and where. Our fair readers are also desired to attend to what a celebrated critic of a neighbouring nation says on the nature and design of tragedy, from the rules laid down by the same great ancient. Rapin, on Aristotle's Poetics. Tragedy, says he, makes man modest, by representing the great masters of the earth humbled; and it makes him tender and merciful, by showing him the strange accidents of life, and the unforeseen disgraces to which the most important persons are subject. But because man is naturally timorous and compassionate, he may fall into other extremes. Too much fear may shake his constancy of mind, and too much of tragedy to regulate these two weaknesses. It prepares and arms him against disgraces by showing them so frequent in the most considerable persons, and he will cease to fear extraordinary accidents when he sees them happen to the highest part of mankind, and still more efficacious, we may add, the example will be, when he sees them happen to the best. But as the end of tragedy is to teach men not to fear too weakly common misfortunes, it proposes also to teach them to spare their compassion for objects that deserve it. For there is an injustice in being moved at the afflictions of those who deserve to be miserable. We may see without pity Clytemnestra slain by her son Orestes in Aeschylus, because she had murdered Agamemnon her husband. Yet we cannot see Hippolytus die by the plot of his stepmother Phaedra in Euripides without compassion, because he died not but for being chaste and virtuous. These are the great authorities so favourable to the stories that end unhappily,
And we beg leave to reinforce this inference from them, that if the temporary sufferings of the virtuous and the good can be accounted for and justified on pagan principles, many more and infinitely stronger reasons will occur to a Christian reader in behalf of what are called unhappy catastrophes, from the consideration of the doctrine of future rewards, which is everywhere strongly enforced in the history of Clarissa. Of this, to give but one instance, an ingenious modern, distinguished by his rank, but much more for his excellent defence of some of the most important doctrines of Christianity, appears convinced in the conclusion of a pathetic monody lately published, in which, after he had deplored as a man without hope, expressing ourselves in the Scripture phrase, the loss of an excellent wife, he thus consoles himself: Yet, O my soul, thy rising murmurs stay, nor dare the all-wise Disposer to arraign, or against his supreme decree, with impious grief complain. That all thy full-blown joys at once should fade, was his most righteous will, and be that will obeyed. Would thy fond love his grace to her control, and in these low abodes of sin and pain, her pure exalted soul unjustly for thy partial good detain? No, rather strive thy grovelling mind to raise up to that unclouded blaze, that heavenly radiance of eternal light, in which enthroned she now with pity sees how frail, how insecure, how slight is every mortal bliss. But of infinitely greater weight than all that has been above produced on this subject are the words of the Psalmist. As for me, says he, my feet were almost gone, my steps had well nigh slipped, for I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked, for their strength is firm, they are not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men. Their eyes stand out with fatness, they have more than their heart could wish. Verily I have cleansed mine heart in vain, and washed my hands in innocence, for all the day long have I been plagued and chastened every morning. When I thought to know this, it was too painful for me, until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then understood I their end. Thou shalt guide me with thy counsel, and afterwards receive me to glory. This is the Psalmist's comfort and dependence. And shall man, presuming to alter the common course of nature, and so far as he is able, to elude the tenure by which frail mortality indispensably holds, imagine that he can make a better dispensation, and by calling it poetical justice, indirectly reflect on the divine? The more pains have been taken to obviate the objections arising from the notion of poetical justice, as the doctrine built upon it had obtained general credit among us, and as it must be confessed to have the appearance of humanity and good nature for its supports. And yet the writer of the history of Clarissa is humbly of opinion that he might have been excused referring to them for the vindication of his catastrophe, even by those who are advocates for the contrary opinion, since the notion of poetical justice, founded on the modern rules, has hardly ever been more strictly observed in works of this nature than in the present performance. For is not Mr. Lovelace, who could persevere in his villanous views, against the strongest and most frequent convictions and remorses that ever were sent to awaken and reclaim a wicked man? Is not this great, this wilful transgressor condignly punished, and his punishment brought on through the intelligence of the very Joseph Leman whom he had corrupted, and by means of the very woman whom he had debauched? Is not Mr. Belton, who had an uncle's hastened death to answer for? Are not the infamous Sinclair and her wretched partners, and even the wicked servants, who with their eyes open contributed their parts to the carrying on of the vile schemes of their respective principals, are they not all likewise exemplarily punished? On the other hand, is not Miss Howe, for her noble friendship to the exalted lady in her calamities? Is not Mr. Hickman, for his unexceptionable morals and integrity of life? Is not the repentant and not ungenerous Belford? Is not the worthy Norton made signally happy? And who that are in earnest in their professions of Christianity, but will rather envy than regret the triumphant death of Clarissa, whose piety from her early childhood, whose diffusive charity, whose steady virtue, whose Christian humility, whose forgiving spirit, whose meekness and resignation, Heaven only could reward? And here it may not be amiss to remind the reader, that so early in the work as Vol. II, Letter 38, the dispensations of Providence are justified by herself. And thus she ends her reflections: I shall not live always. May my closing scene be happy. She had her wish. It was happy. We shall now, according to the expectation given in the preface to this edition, proceed to take brief notice of such other objections as have come to our knowledge; for, as is there said, this work being addressed to the public as a history of life and manners, those parts of it which are proposed to carry with them the force of example ought to be as unobjectionable as is consistent with the design of the whole,
and with human nature. Several persons have censured the heroine as too cold in her love, too haughty, and even sometimes provoking. But we may presume to say, that this objection has arisen from want of attention to the story, to the character of Clarissa, and to her particular situation. It was not intended that she should be in love, but in liking only, if that expression may be admitted. It is meant to be every where inculcated in the story for example's sake, that she never would have married Mr. Lovelace because of his immoralities, had she been left to herself, and that of her ruin was principally owing to the persecutions of her friends. What is too generally called love ought, perhaps as generally, to be called by another name. Cupidity, or Paphian stimulus, as some women, even of condition, have acted, are not words too harsh to be substituted on the occasion, however grating they may be to delicate ears. But take the word love in the gentlest and most honourable sense. It would have been thought by some highly improbable, that Clarissa should have been able to show such a command of her passions, as makes so distinguishing a part of her character, had she been as violently in love, as certain warm and fierce spirits would have had her to be. A few observations are thrown in by way of note in the present edition, at proper places to obviate this objection, or rather to bespeak the attention of hasty readers to what lies obviously before them. For thus the heroine anticipates this very objection, expostulating with Miss Howe on her contemptuous treatment of Mr. Hickman, which, far from being guilty of the same fault herself, she did on all occasions, and declares she would do so, whenever Miss Howe forgot herself, although she had not a day to live. O my dear, says she, that it had been my lot, as I was not permitted to live single, to have met with a man by whom I could have acted generously and unreservedly. Mr. Lovelace, it is now plain, in order to have a pretence against me, taxed my behaviour to him with stiffness and distance. You, at one time, thought me guilty of some degree of prudery. Difficult situations should be allowed for, which often make seeming occasions for censure unavoidable. I deserved not blame from him who made mine difficult. And you, my dear, had I any other man to deal with than Mr. Lovelace, or had he but half the merit which Mr. Hickman has, would have found that my doctrine on this subject should have governed my whole practice. It has been thought by some worthy and ingenious persons, that if Lovelace had been drawn an infidel or scoffer, his character, according to the taste of the present worse than sceptical age, would have been more natural. It is, however, too well known that there are very many persons of this cast whose actions discredit their belief, and are not the very devils in Scripture said to believe and tremble. But the reader must have observed that great, and it is hoped good use, has been made throughout the work, by drawing Lovelace an infidel only in practice, and this as well in the arguments of his friend Belford, as in his own frequent remorses, when touched with temporary compunction, and in his last scenes, which could not have been made had either of them been painted as sentimental unbelievers. Not to say that Clarissa, whose great objection to Mr. Wyerley was, that he was a scoffer, must have been inexcusable had she known Lovelace to be so, and had given the least attention to his addresses. On the contrary, thus she comforts herself when she thinks she must be his. This one consolation, however, remains: he is not an infidel, an unbeliever. Had he been an infidel, there would have been no room at all for hope of him. But priding himself as he does in his fertile invention, he would have been utterly abandoned, irreclaimable, and a savage. And it must be observed that scoffers are too witty in their own opinion, in other words, value themselves too much upon their profligacy, to aim at concealing it. Besides, had Lovelace added ribald jests upon religion to his other liberties, the freedoms which would then have passed between him and his friend must have been of a nature truly infernal. And this further hint was meant to be given by way of inference, that the man who allowed himself in those liberties either of speech or action which Lovelace thought shameful was so far a worse man than Lovelace. For this reason he is every where made to treat jests on sacred things and subjects, even down to the mythology of the pagans among pagans, as undoubted marks of the ill breeding of the jester. Obscene images and talk, as liberties too shameful for even rakes to allow themselves in, and injustice to creditors, and in matters of meum and tuum, as what it was beneath him to be guilty of. Some have objected to the meekness, to the tameness, as they will have it to be, of Mr. Hickman's character. And yet Lovelace owns that he rose upon him with great spirit in the interview between them, once when he thought a reflection was but implied on Miss Howe, and another time when he imagined himself treated contemptuously. Miss Howe, it must be owned, though not to the credit of her own character, treats him ludicrously on several occasions. But so she does her mother. And perhaps a lady of her lively turn would have treated as whimsically any man but a Lovelace.
Mr. Belford speaks of him with honour and respect. So does Colonel Morden, and so does Clarissa on every occasion. And all that Miss Howe herself says of him tends more to his reputation than discredit, as Clarissa indeed tells her. And as to Lovelace's treatment of him, the reader must have observed that it was his way to treat every man with contempt, partly by way of self-exaltation, and partly to gratify the natural gaiety of his disposition. He says himself to Belford, "Thou knowest I love him not, Jack, and whom we love not, we cannot allow a merit to, perhaps not the merit they should be granted." Modest and diffident men, writes Belford to Lovelace in praise of Mr. Hickman, wear not soon off those little precisenesses which the confident, if ever they had them, presently get over. But as Miss Howe treats her mother as freely as she does her lover, so does Mr. Lovelace take still greater liberties with Mr. Belford than he does with Mr. Hickman, with respect to his person, air, and address, as Mr. Belford himself hints to Mr. Hickman. And yet is he not so readily believed to the discredit of Mr. Belford, by the ladies in general, as he is when he disparages Mr. Hickman? Whence can this particularity arise? Mr. Belford had been a rake, but was in a way of reformation. Mr. Hickman had always been a good man. And Lovelace confidently says, that the women love a man whose regard for them is founded in the knowledge of them. Nevertheless, it must be owned, that it was not purposed to draw Mr. Hickman as the man of whom the ladies in general were likely to be very fond. Had it been so, goodness of heart and gentleness of manners, great assiduity, and inviolable and modest love, would not of themselves have been supposed sufficient recommendations. He would not have been allowed the least share of preciseness or formality, although those defects might have been imputed to his reverence for the object of his passion. But in his character it was designed to show, that the same man could not be every thing, and to intimate to ladies, that in choosing companions for life, they should rather prefer the honest heart of a Hickman, which would be all their own, than to risk the chance of sharing, perhaps with scores, and some of those probably the most profligate of the sex, the volatile, mischievous one of a Lovelace. In short, that they should choose, if they wish for durable happiness, for rectitude of mind, and not for speciousness of person or address, nor make a jest of a good man in favour of a bad one, who would make a jest of them, and of their whole sex. 2 letters, however, by way of accommodation, are inserted in this edition, which perhaps will give Mr. Hickman's character some heightening with such ladies as love spirit in a man, and had rather suffer by it than not meet with it. Women, born to be controlled, stoop to the forward and the bold, says Waller, and Lovelace too. Some have wished that the story had been told in the usual narrative way of telling stories designed to amuse and divert, and not in letters written by the respective persons whose history is given in them. The author thinks he ought not to prescribe to the taste of others, but imagined himself at liberty to follow his own. He perhaps mistrusted his talents for the narrative kind of writing. He had the good fortune to succeed in the epistolary way once before. A story in which so many persons were concerned either principally or collaterally, and of characters and dispositions so various, carried on with tolerable connection and perspicuity, in a series of letters from different persons, without the aid of digressions and episodes foreign to the principal end and design, he thought had novelty to be pleaded for it, and that, in the present age, he supposed would not be a slight recommendation. Besides what has been said above, and in the preface on this head, the following opinion of an ingenious and candid foreigner on this manner of writing may not be improperly inserted here. The method which the author had pursued in the history of Clarissa is the same as in the life of Pamela. Both are related in familiar letters by the parties themselves, at the very time in which the events happened, and this method has given the author great advantages, which he could not have drawn from any other species of narration. The minute particulars of events, the sentiments and conversation of the parties, are, upon this plan, exhibited with all the warmth and spirit that the passion supposed to be predominant at the very time could produce, and with all the distinguishing characteristics which memory can supply in a history of recent transactions. Romances in general, and Marivaux amongst others, are wholly improbable, because they suppose the history to be written after the series of events is closed by the catastrophe, a circumstance which implies a strength of memory beyond all example and probability in the persons concerned, enabling them at the distance of several years to relate all the particulars of a transient conversation, or rather it implies a yet more improbable confidence and familiarity between all these persons and the author. There is, however, one difficulty attending the epistolary method, for it is necessary that all the characters should have an uncommon taste for this kind of conversation, and that they should suffer no event, not even a remarkable conversation, to pass, without immediately committing it to writing. But for the preservation of the letters once written, the author has provided with great judgment, so as to render this circumstance highly probable. This quotation is translated from a critique on the history of Clarissa, written in French and published at Amsterdam. The whole critique, rendered into English, was inserted in the Gentleman's Magazine of June and August 1749. The author has done great honour in it to the history of Clarissa, and as there are remarks published with it, which answer several objections made to different passages in the story by that candid foreigner, the reader is referred to the aforesaid magazine for both. It is presumed that what this gentleman says of the difficulties attending a story thus given in the epistolary manner of writing will not be found to reach the history before us. It is very well accounted for in it how the two principal female characters came to take so great a delight in writing. Their subjects are not merely subjects of amusement, but greatly interesting to both. Yet many ladies there are who now laudably correspond, when at distance from each other, on occasions that far less affect their mutual welfare and friendships than those treated of by these ladies. The two principal gentlemen had motives of gaiety and vain glory for their inducements. It will generally be found, that persons who have talents for familiar writing, as these correspondents are presumed to have, will not forbear amusing themselves with their pens on less arduous occasions than what offer to these. These four, whose stories have a connection with each other, out of the great number of characters who are introduced in this history, are only eminent in the epistolary way. The rest appear but as occasional writers, and as drawn in rather by necessity than choice, from the different relations in which they stand with the four principal persons. The length of the piece has been objected to by some, who perhaps looked upon it as a mere novel or romance, and yet of these there are not wanting works of equal length. They were of opinion that the story moved too slowly, particularly in the first and second volumes, which are chiefly taken up with the altercations between Clarissa and the several persons of her family. But is it not true that those altercations are the foundation of the whole, and therefore a necessary part of the work? The letters and conversations, where the story makes the slowest progress, are presumed to be characteristic. They give occasion, likewise, to suggest many interesting personalities, in which a good deal of the instruction essential to a work of this nature is conveyed. And it will, moreover, be remembered that the author, at his first setting out, apprized the reader that the story, interesting as it is generally allowed to be, was to be principally looked upon as the vehicle to the instruction. To all which we may add, that there was frequently a necessity to be very circumstantial and minute, in order to preserve and maintain that air of probability which is necessary to be maintained in a story designed to represent real life, and which is rendered extremely busy and active by the plots and contrivances formed and carried on by one of the principal characters. Some there are, and ladies too, who have supposed that the excellencies of the heroine are carried to an improbable and even to an impracticable height in this history. But the education of Clarissa from early childhood ought to be considered as one of her very great advantages, as indeed the foundation of all her excellencies; and it is to be hoped, for the sake of the doctrine designed to be inculcated by it, that it will. She had a pious, well-read, a not meanly descended woman for her nurse, who with her milk, as Mrs. Harlowe says, gave her that nurture which no other nurse could give her. She was very early happy in the conversation visits of her learned and worthy Dr. Lewen, and in her correspondences, not with him only, but with other divines mentioned in her last will. Her mother was, upon the whole, a good woman, who did credit to her birth and fortune, and both delighted in her for those improvements and attainments which gave her, and them in her, a distinction that caused it to be said, that when she was out of the family, it was considered but as a common family. She was, moreover, a country lady, and, as we have seen in Miss Howe's character of her, took great delight in rural and household employments, though qualified to adorn the brightest circle. It must be confessed that we are not to look for Clarissa's name among the constant frequenters of Ranelagh and Vauxhall, nor among those who may be called daughters of the card table. If we do, the character of our heroine may then, indeed, only be justly thought not improbable, but unattainable. But we have neither room in this place nor inclination to pursue a subject so invidious. We quit it, therefore, after we have repeated that we know there are some, and we hope there are many, in the British dominions, or they are hardly anywhere in the European world, who, as far as occasion has called upon them to exert the like humble and modest, yet steady and useful virtues, have reached the perfections of a Clarissa. Having thus briefly taken notice of the most material objections that have been made to different parts of this history, it is hoped we may be allowed to add, that had we thought ourselves at liberty to give copies of some of the many letters that have been written on the other side of the question, that is to say, in approbation of the catastrophe, and of the general conduct and execution of the work, by some of the most eminent judges of composition in every branch of literature, most of what has been written in this postscript might have been spared. But as the principal objection with many has lain against the length of the piece, we shall add to what we have said above on that subject, in the words of one of those eminent writers, that if, in the history before us, it shall be found that the spirit is duly diffused throughout, that the characters are various and natural, well distinguished and uniformly supported and maintained, if there be a variety of incidents sufficient to excite attention, and those so conducted as to keep the reader always awake, the length then must add proportionably to the pleasure that every person of taste receives from a well-drawn picture of nature. But where the contrary of all these qualities shock the understanding, the extravagant performance will be judged tedious, though no longer than a fairy tale. Finis. End of conclusion, Part 2. Recording by Nicole Lee. End of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson.